The final decades of the Western Roman Empire were characterized by a profound and irreversible disintegration of imperial authority. The centralized control that had once been the hallmark of Roman governance had fractured into a patchwork of autonomous territories. These lands were not governed by the Senate or a unified imperial administration, but by powerful Germanic warlords and tribal confederations who wielded genuine military and political power while paying only nominal deference to the emperor. This de facto fragmentation was formally acknowledged in 476 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus. This event, rather than a singular violent overthrow, was the culmination of a century of institutional decline. It marked the moment when a barbarian leader, not a Roman general, chose to govern Italy under his own authority, sending the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The consequences of this institutional collapse were far-reaching. The complex and layered bureaucracy that had managed the provinces for centuries dissolved. Tax collection systems ceased to function on a large scale, starving the central government of the revenue required to sustain a professional army. Without a unified military, the remnants of the Roman state were incapable of defending their borders, forcing them to rely on the very Germanic tribes they had previously fought. These groups, initially brought in as allies, progressively solidified their control over vast regions of Gaul, Hispania, and Africa, establishing independent kingdoms. The fall of Rome had an immense psychological impact. For over a millennium, the concept of a perpetual Roman Empire had been a cornerstone of Western identity. The reality of its decline created a vacuum of authority and an intellectual crisis. An institution once thought to be eternal was gone, and no political or religious entity was yet prepared to fully inherit its mantle. The Roman population, long accustomed to a rigid legal and social framework, now found themselves under the rule of Germanic kings who operated according to different customs and laws. This political void would be gradually filled by a new, hybrid concept of authority. It was a synthesis that would merge the military prowess of Germanic tribal law with the cultural and religious traditions of the Roman world. This synthesis, which would eventually be named the Holy Roman Empire, was not a simple continuation of the Roman state, but a new entity born from its ashes, designed to fill the vacuum of legitimacy left by the twilight of the Western Empire. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. In the vacuum left by the collapse of Roman authority in Gaul, a new power emerged: the Franks. Unlike other Germanic tribes that simply raided or settled within Roman borders, the Franks pursued a more strategic and enduring path. Their consolidation began under a series of ambitious rulers, culminating with Clovis I of the Merovingian dynasty in the late 5th century. Clovis successfully unified the disparate Frankish tribes and, through a combination of military campaigns and strategic diplomacy, expanded his control over much of Roman Gaul. A pivotal moment in this consolidation was the Battle of Soissons in 486 AD. By defeating the last Roman general in Gaul, Syagrius, Clovis eliminated the final vestiges of Roman military authority in the region. His subsequent victory over the Alemanni in 496 AD at the Battle of Tolbiac marked another significant expansion of his power. Following this victory, Clovis famously converted to Nicene Christianity. This conversion, unlike the Arian Christianity adopted by many other Germanic rulers, was crucial. It forged a powerful alliance with the Roman Catholic Church, a bond that provided the Franks with a unique source of legitimacy and support among the Romanized populations of Gaul. This new political order was not a simple replacement of Roman rule, but a synthesis of cultures. The Franks, while maintaining their Germanic military traditions and customs, absorbed Roman administrative and legal practices. The Merovingian kings utilized Roman titles and incorporated Roman citizens into their bureaucracy. This pragmatic approach allowed them to govern vast territories with a complex population of both Roman Gallo-Romans and Franks. The strategic alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the Catholic Church laid the institutional groundwork for a new type of empire in Western Europe. It was this unified and religiously sanctioned power that would eventually provide the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would define the continent for centuries. Charlemagne's reign, spanning from 768 to 814 AD, was a transformative era for Western Europe. It marked a period of deliberate cultural and intellectual revival, often referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Central to this movement was Charlemagne's court at his capital of Aachen, which he envisioned as a new center of learning and governance. The emperor, a figure of immense political and military authority, was deeply concerned by what he saw as a decline in literacy and classical knowledge across his vast territories. To combat this, he orchestrated a systematic program to restore and preserve the foundations of Roman learning. He attracted some of the most prominent scholars of the age to his court, most notably Alcuin of York. Alcuin, a celebrated English monk and intellectual, became the head of the palace school at Aachen. This institution, though more a gathering of brilliant minds than a formal university, was tasked with a monumental mission: the education of the clergy and nobility. The curriculum focused on the liberal arts, including grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, alongside arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. This scholarly environment fostered a renewed interest in classical Latin literature and patristic texts that had fallen into disuse. One of the most enduring achievements of this revival was the standardization of writing. The script in use at the time was highly varied and often illegible. To address this, Charlemagne's scholars developed Carolingian minuscule, a clear and uniform script. This new script made manuscripts easier to read and copy, a critical development for the widespread preservation and dissemination of knowledge. Scribes across the empire adopted the new hand, leading to a dramatic increase in the production of books and the establishment of scriptoria in monasteries. This facilitated the copying of classical works that might otherwise have been lost to history. In addition to intellectual pursuits, Charlemagne sought to standardize religious practices. He believed that a unified liturgy and clear religious doctrine were essential for the spiritual health of his empire. He implemented reforms aimed at correcting errors in scriptural texts, standardizing the Roman Rite, and ensuring that all clergy were properly educated. This process solidified the institutional power of the Church throughout the Frankish lands. The emperor also implemented sweeping administrative changes. His traveling officials, known as missi dominici, were sent out in pairs, one cleric and one layman, to oversee the actions of local counts and ensure the emperor's decrees were being carried out. This system of checks and balances provided a level of centralized control that was unprecedented in post-Roman Western Europe. Ultimately, the Carolingian Renaissance was a state-sponsored effort to create a coherent political and cultural identity for a new empire. By fostering scholarship, standardizing writing, and unifying religious and administrative practices, Charlemagne laid the institutional and ideological foundation that would influence the Holy Roman Empire for centuries to come. The year 800 AD marked a pivotal moment in the political and religious history of Western Europe. The event was not a sudden act, but the culmination of a complex political alliance between the Frankish king, Charlemagne, and the papacy. Pope Leo III at the time was in a precarious position in Rome. He had been accused of various crimes by the Roman aristocracy, leading to a violent assault that forced him to flee to Charlemagne's court at Paderborn. Charlemagne, as the most powerful ruler in Western Europe and a staunch defender of the Church, provided the Pope with safe passage and military protection, a critical demonstration of his authority and loyalty. By restoring Pope Leo to his position in Rome, Charlemagne had cemented his status as the de facto protector of the Roman Church and its leader, setting the stage for a new form of temporal and spiritual power. On Christmas Day of that year, during a ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica, a momentous event occurred. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo III placed a crown upon his head. The crowd, likely prompted, then acclaimed him as Augustus, crowned by God, great and pacific Emperor of the Romans. This act was deeply symbolic. For the first time in over 3 centuries, a ruler in the West had been given the imperial title. The Byzantine Empire in the East, which had long viewed itself as the sole legitimate successor to Roman authority, was ruled by Empress Irene, whose claim to the throne was considered illegitimate by the Roman Church. By crowning Charlemagne, the Pope was not just bestowing a title, he was symbolically transferring the legacy of the Roman Empire to the Frankish kingdom, creating a new Western imperial line. The immediate aftermath was characterized by significant political tension. Charlemagne later expressed dissatisfaction with the way the coronation was performed, stating that, had he known of the Pope's intent, he would not have entered the church. This reaction has been interpreted by historians as an assertion of imperial independence, as the method of the coronation, the Pope placing the crown on his head, could be seen to suggest papal supremacy over imperial power. The legitimacy of the new Western emperor was also not universally accepted. The Byzantine Empire, which controlled the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, initially refused to recognize Charlemagne's imperial title. They viewed the coronation as a direct challenge to their authority and the concept of a single, universal Roman Empire. This diplomatic crisis would continue for years before a grudging acknowledgement was eventually reached. Regardless of the immediate tensions, the coronation of 800 AD had profound and lasting consequences. It created a powerful and enduring political ideal that would become the foundation of the Holy Roman Empire. The act formally linked the papacy to the secular power of a Germanic ruler, forging a symbiotic relationship between church and state that would define European politics for centuries. It provided the Frankish kingdom with a new source of religious and historical legitimacy, transforming a regional power into a dynasty with a universal claim to authority. This new imperial concept, blending Roman tradition with Christian doctrine and Germanic military might, was a distinct political entity that would continue to evolve and define the continent. Charlemagne's death in 814 AD brought a swift end to the political unity he had forged across Western Europe. While his son, Louis the Pious, inherited the empire intact, his reign was plagued by internal strife and civil wars among his own sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald. These conflicts, fueled by personal ambitions and competing claims to territories, tore apart the very fabric of the Carolingian state. The immense logistical and military burdens of maintaining such a vast realm proved too great for a system that was fundamentally based on the personal loyalty and political strength of a single ruler. The central administration, a hallmark of Charlemagne's reign, was unable to withstand the pressures of familial succession disputes, and the empire began to fracture along linguistic and cultural lines. The culmination of this internecine conflict was the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD. This landmark agreement formally dissolved the unified Carolingian Empire and established the political landscape of medieval Europe for centuries to come. The treaty divided Charlemagne's territories into 3 distinct kingdoms. The westernmost portion, West Francia, was granted to Charles the Bald, a territory that would eventually form the basis of the Kingdom of France. The eastern portion, East Francia, was given to Louis the German, a realm from which the future Holy Roman Empire would eventually emerge. The third, and most precarious portion, the Middle Kingdom or Lotharingia, was granted to Lothair, who also retained the imperial title. This kingdom stretched from the Low Countries down through Burgundy and into northern Italy, a long, geographically fragmented corridor that lacked a cohesive political identity. The partition had profound and lasting consequences. It created a geopolitical reality where the newly formed kingdoms, no longer bound by a single imperial authority, were left to their own devices. The imperial title, once a symbol of universal dominion, was now attached to a weak, vulnerable Middle Kingdom, rendering its authority largely symbolic. This fragmentation gave rise to powerful regional magnates and autonomous duchies who held significant local power, further decentralizing the political structure of the former empire. The legal and administrative reforms of the Carolingian era, which had provided a degree of centralized governance, began to erode. In West Francia, this contributed to the rise of feudalism, while in East Francia, it laid the groundwork for a distinct political evolution. The division of 843 AD was not merely a territorial settlement. It was a fundamental shift that created a new political paradigm, one where authority would no longer flow exclusively from a single imperial source, but would be contested and distributed among multiple competing powers. It was from this fragmented landscape that the ideal of a unified, albeit decentralized, Holy Roman Empire would eventually be reborn. Following the disintegration of the Carolingian dynasty in East Francia, the kingdom faced a critical period of political uncertainty. The death of Louis the Child in 911 AD marked the end of the Carolingian line in the east, leaving a power vacuum and a realm threatened by internal rivalries and external invasions. The German dukes, representing the powerful regional duchies of Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, and Bavaria, faced a momentous decision whether to fragment completely into independent territories or to elect a new king to preserve the unity of the realm. In 919 AD, they chose the latter, formally electing Henry the Fowler, the Duke of Saxony, as their king. This act was not based on dynastic inheritance, but on a pragmatic choice by the most influential nobles, an important precedent that would influence the imperial monarchy for centuries. Henry's reign was characterized by a meticulous and methodical approach to consolidating power. Rather than immediately seeking the imperial title, he focused on building a stable and secure kingdom. He secured the loyalty of the other dukes through a combination of diplomatic alliances and military pressure, acknowledging their semi-autonomous status while asserting his own royal authority. He shrewdly recognized that the primary threat to his new kingdom came not from within, but from the relentless incursions of the nomadic Magyars from the east and the seaborne raids of the Vikings from the north. His response to these existential threats was both innovative and effective. To counter the Magyar cavalry, Henry implemented a significant military reform. He ordered the construction of a network of fortified strongholds, or burgwards, spaced at strategic intervals across the eastern frontier. These garrisons served as refuges for the local population and provided a base for his newly trained cavalry forces. For every 9 common soldiers, one was chosen to be a mounted warrior, tasked with defending these strongpoints. He also leveraged the existing Saxon levy, but the emphasis on a mobile professional cavalry was a critical shift in military doctrine. These preparations culminated in a decisive victory. In 933 AD, at the Battle of Riade, Henry's forces soundly defeated a large Magyar army, halting their incursions and securing the eastern border of the kingdom for a generation. Simultaneously, he conducted successful campaigns against the Vikings, driving them from the northern frontiers and establishing a greater degree of control over the Slavic tribes to the east. By the end of his reign, Henry had transformed the East Frankish realm from a fragile, fragmented entity into a stable and cohesive kingdom. His focus on security and internal consolidation provided the essential political and military foundation that his son and successor, Otto I, would leverage to revive the imperial title and forge a new empire. Inheriting the East Frankish kingdom from his father, Otto I proved to be a ruler of immense vision. But his ascension was not without immediate challenges. He faced rebellions from powerful regional dukes and members of his own family who resisted the centralization of power. Otto's primary strategy to counter this internal fragmentation was to forge a strategic alliance with the church. He appointed loyal bishops and abbots to positions of secular authority, granting them land and judicial rights. This network of ecclesiastics, indebted to the king for their power, served as a crucial check on the ambitions of the hereditary nobility. The church's administrative capabilities and literacy also provided a much-needed bureaucratic framework for governing his expanding realm. This symbiotic relationship known as the Ottonian system, was a cornerstone of his rule and a key institutional foundation of the future empire. Otto's military successes were the ultimate guarantor of his authority. He conducted several campaigns into Italy to assert his influence and intervene in papal politics, a move that would later prove pivotal. However, his most defining achievement came from a threat to the heart of his kingdom. For decades, the nomadic Magyars had ravaged Central Europe with their swift and destructive cavalry raids. They had humiliated previous rulers and posed a constant existential threat to the stability of the East Frankish realm. Otto recognized that a decisive victory against them was essential not only for security, but also for his legitimacy as the preeminent leader of the German peoples. This culmination of military and political pressure came to a head at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD. Leading a multi-ethnic army that included Saxon, Bavarian, Swabian, and Bohemian contingents, Otto confronted the main Magyar force near Augsburg. His forces, bolstered by the disciplined heavy cavalry his father had developed, met the Magyar horse archers on open ground. The battle was fiercely contested, but Otto's strategic deployment and the resilience of his heavy cavalry ultimately carried the day. The Magyars were routed, their leaders captured, and their threat to Central Europe was permanently neutralized. The victory at Lechfeld was more than a military triumph. It cemented Otto's authority over the German dukes and earned him the title Otto the Great from his contemporaries. He was hailed as the savior of Christendom, the defender of Europe against pagan invaders. This elevated status, combined with his already strong position in the East Frankish realm, gave him the leverage and prestige to pursue a greater ambition. His subsequent campaigns in Italy were not merely about conquest, but about asserting his role as the successor to Charlemagne. The defeat of a formidable external foe had created the perfect political climate for the revival of a universal imperial ideal, one that transcended the fragmented kingdoms of the continent and laid the groundwork for his eventual imperial coronation. The culmination of Otto I's strategic successes came with his momentous journey to Italy. Pope John XII, facing political and military threats from Italian nobles and local factions, urgently sought a powerful protector. He appealed to Otto, a ruler whose military might was unparalleled in Central Europe, and whose pious reputation made him a suitable champion for the Church. Otto's arrival in Rome in 962 AD was not merely a military expedition, it was a carefully orchestrated political maneuver. His forces secured the city and restored the Pope's authority, paving the way for a historic event. On February 2, 962 AD, at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope John XII formally crowned Otto I as Roman Emperor. This act was a deliberate and public revival of the tradition established by Charlemagne almost 162 years earlier. The ceremonial anointing with holy oil and the placement of the imperial crown upon Otto's head was more than a gesture. It imbued his rule with a sacred, universal legitimacy that no other European king could claim. The title Holy Roman Emperor reflected a profound dual authority: secular power rooted in his German kingship and divine sanction bestowed by the Pope, making him the protector and supreme temporal ruler of Christendom. The coronation immediately reshaped the political landscape of Europe. It established a new and complex relationship between the German monarchy and the papacy. While the Pope gained a powerful military protector, he also created a secular overlord with direct influence over Italian affairs. This arrangement was a source of great power for both parties, but it also contained the seeds of future conflict. Otto, in turn, gained the supreme title, which gave him a theoretical seniority over other European monarchs, including the kings of West Francia. However, this authority was often more symbolic than practical, especially in the fragmented political reality of Italy. The renewed empire was fundamentally different from its Carolingian predecessor. Its core lay not in the sprawling territories of France, but in the German duchies. The imperial title was now inextricably linked to the German kingship. The ruler of Germany was the primary candidate for the imperial crown. making his control over the German realm a prerequisite for universal authority. The Ottonian dynasty, in its pursuit of the imperial ideal, would continually be drawn into Italian politics, a commitment that would shape the empire's trajectory for centuries. The coronation in 962 AD did not restore the Roman Empire of antiquity. It created a new political entity, a unique synthesis of Germanic power and Christian universalism that would define the political and religious life of Central Europe for almost 1,000 years. Its institutional foundation, built upon the complex interplay between the emperor's authority and the pope's spiritual power, was cemented in this singular, transformative event. Following his imperial coronation, Otto I, a persistent challenge to his authority from the powerful German dukes. These hereditary nobles commanded vast territories and military forces, often acting as autonomous rulers who posed a constant threat to the centralized power of the monarchy. They viewed the king as a first among equals and resisted any attempts at imperial overreach. Otto recognized that he could not rely on the loyalty of these secular magnates, as their allegiances were often tied to their own dynastic interests. To secure his rule and ensure the stability of the nascent empire, he developed a radical new administrative framework that would become a defining feature of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. This innovative approach is known as the Ottonian system. Its core principle was the strategic elevation of churchmen, bishops, and abbots to positions of secular authority. Instead of entrusting administrative and military duties to hereditary dukes, Otto began granting imperial fiefs, judicial rights, and even command of armies to loyal ecclesiastics. A bishop appointed to a region would govern it not only as a spiritual leader, but as a temporal count or duke, holding power directly from the emperor. This created a powerful and loyal counterweight to the secular nobility, whose power was based on their birthright, and who often saw the king as a rival. The genius of the Ottonian system was its inherent mechanism of control. Unlike the secular dukes, bishops and abbots did not have legitimate heirs. Their positions and the lands granted to them were not passed down to a son. When a bishop died, his fief and all its accompanying rights reverted to the emperor, who was then free to appoint a new, loyal successor. This prevented the consolidation of dynastic power and ensured that the emperor's authority remained paramount. The church officials, in turn, benefited from this arrangement. They were protected from the political machinations of the secular nobility and were elevated to a level of power they could not have achieved on their own. The ecclesiastics were also uniquely suited for their roles. Many were literate, educated, and well-versed in the administrative practices of the church, providing Otto with a skilled and reliable bureaucracy. This unique blend of religious and secular authority defined the early empire. It created a powerful and effective governmental structure that bypassed the unreliable feudal network and provided the emperor with a loyal, stable, and disciplined base of support. The Ottonian system was a political masterstroke that not only secured Otto's reign, but also provided the institutional foundation for the empire he had just forged. With his coronation in 962, Otto I's imperial title necessitated a persistent engagement with the Italian peninsula. This was not a matter of choice, but a fundamental requirement of his new rank. An emperor's legitimacy was not considered complete without a papal coronation in the city of Rome, a ceremonial link to the ancient imperial past that transcended the power of his German kingship. Consequently, the Ottonian emperors were continually drawn south of the Alps, not for simple diplomatic visits, but for large-scale military campaigns to secure their authority. These Italian expeditions became a defining and recurring element of the early empire's history. The political reality of Italy was a stark contrast to the nascent stability of Otto's German territories. The peninsula was a patchwork of warring city-states, ambitious local nobles, and a politically volatile papacy. The Ottonian emperors were forced to intervene repeatedly, putting down rebellions, installing and deposing popes, and asserting their suzerainty over a realm that often resisted their influence. These campaigns, while essential for maintaining the imperial title, were enormously resource-intensive. Crossing the Alps required immense logistical planning and the mobilization of a substantial army. The long absences of the emperor from the German heartland also created opportunities for restive dukes and princes to challenge his authority, leading to new cycles of rebellion that had to be suppressed upon his return. This consistent focus on Italian affairs led to a unique set of challenges. The emperors became deeply entangled in the internal politics of the church, a relationship that would become a central struggle for power in the coming centuries. While they were the papacy's military protectors, they also exercised direct influence over papal elections, ensuring the appointment of loyal pro-imperial candidates. This symbiotic relationship, while powerful, was fraught with tension. The popes, in turn, sought to leverage the emperor's need for a coronation to advance their own ecclesiastical and territorial claims. Furthermore, the need to maintain an Italian presence drained the empire of vital resources and manpower. The German princes and nobility, while bound to serve in the imperial army, grew weary of campaigns that offered little direct benefit to their own lands. The constant diversion of resources to Italy meant that the German kingdom's internal development was often secondary to the needs of the wider imperial project. The quest for a universal, divinely sanctioned authority in Italy came at the cost of a centralized, secure German state. This perpetual strategic dilemma would haunt the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, as each emperor had to balance the prestige of his Italian crown against the practicalities of ruling his German domain. The transition from the Ottonian to the Salian dynasty marked a new chapter in the Holy Roman Empire's history. Following the death of the childless Emperor Henry II in 1024, the German nobles, adhering to the principle of elective monarchy, chose Conrad II, a distant relative of the Ottonian line, as king. This election signified a shift in the ruling house, but a continuation of the imperial project. Conrad's reign began a new dynasty that would lead the empire for over a century. Unlike his predecessors, Conrad II faced a political landscape where both the papacy and the territorial princes were beginning to assert their power with renewed vigor. The Salian emperors continued the administrative system established by the Ottonians, relying heavily on the church as a foundation of imperial power. They strategically appointed bishops and abbots to key governmental and military positions, granting them secular authority and imperial fiefs. This practice remained a crucial tool for counterbalancing the power of the secular dukes, whose hereditary claims often threatened the emperor's central control. However, this system was increasingly challenged by an assertive papacy, advocating for church reform and independence from secular influence. This tension would eventually culminate in the investiture controversy, a major conflict that defined the late Salian period. A key development under the Salian rulers was their focus on the development of their imperial territories within Germany. While previous emperors had been consistently drawn into Italian affairs to secure their coronations and suppress rebellions, the Salians paid greater attention to consolidating their power base. They invested in the expansion and management of the Reichsgut, or royal domains. These imperial lands were a vital source of revenue and direct military support, providing a more reliable foundation for central authority than the often unpredictable feudal levies from the dukes. The Salians also relied on a new class of imperial ministers, the ministeriales, who were unfree servants given administrative and military responsibilities. Their loyalty was absolute, as their power and status were entirely dependent on the emperor's favor. This strategy of strengthening the central government through a loyal, non-hereditary bureaucracy proved effective in the early decades of the dynasty. It allowed the emperors to maintain control over the German kingdom despite the growing assertiveness of the princes. The Salians also introduced and codified legal principles that aimed to unify the diverse territories of the empire under a more cohesive administrative framework. This focus on institutional and legal development marked a departure from the more charismatic warrior-king style of the early Ottonians. The Salian dynasty, while inheriting the imperial title, was defined by its response to an evolving European political landscape, seeking to build a more formalized and robust imperial structure from its core German domains. The most significant conflict of the 11th century was the monumental struggle between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. This clash, centered on the issue of lay investiture, was a fundamental challenge to the Ottonian system that had defined the empire for over a century. Lay investiture referred to the practice where a secular ruler, such as the emperor, granted a bishop or abbot the symbols of their spiritual office, the ring and crozier. While seemingly a ceremonial act, it represented the emperor's control over the appointment of high-ranking church officials, a cornerstone of his power. These ecclesiastics served not only as spiritual leaders, but as loyal administrators and military commanders, a crucial counterbalance to the rebellious hereditary German dukes. Pope Gregory VII, however, saw this practice as a grave corruption of the church. He led a powerful reform movement that sought to centralize all ecclesiastical authority in Rome and liberate the clergy from secular control. For him, the emperor's appointment of bishops was an unholy interference in divine matters. In 1075, Gregory issued a decree forbidding lay investiture, a direct and unambiguous attack on the very mechanism that sustained imperial power. Henry IV, who had just suppressed a Saxon rebellion and felt his authority was secure, viewed this papal decree as an unacceptable infringement on his imperial rights and a direct challenge to his authority. The conflict escalated rapidly. In 1076, Henry convened a council of German bishops who, reliant on imperial favour for their positions, declared the Pope deposed. Gregory responded with the most powerful spiritual weapon at his disposal. He excommunicated Henry IV, releasing all the emperor's subjects from their oaths of fealty. This act created a political crisis in Germany. The princes, sensing an opportunity to weaken the emperor, threatened to elect a new king if Henry did not reconcile with the Pope. To save his crown, Henry was forced to make a desperate and humiliating journey across the Alps in the harsh winter of 1077. He met the Pope at the fortress of Canossa in Italy and stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days, begging for forgiveness. The walk to Canossa, a moment of unprecedented spiritual triumph for the papacy, resulted in Gregory lifting the excommunication. However, the victory was temporary. Once reinstated, Henry renewed his conflict with the Pope, eventually invading Rome and installing an anti-pope. Yet, the damage was done. The long-term effects of the investiture controversy were profound. It severely weakened the emperor's authority in Germany by emboldening the princes and shifting power away from the central government. The papacy, in turn, emerged as an independent and powerful political force in Europe. The dispute was finally resolved with the Concordat of Worms in 1122, a compromise that distinguished between the spiritual and secular aspects of the appointments. While the emperor gave up the right to invest bishops with the ring and crozier, he retained the right to be present at their election and invest them with their secular landholdings. This treaty, while a formal end to the conflict, represented a lasting defeat for imperial power and a fundamental reordering of the relationship between church and state. The submission of Emperor Henry IV to Pope Gregory VII at the fortress of Canossa in January 1077 was a pivotal moment in medieval European history. While seemingly a complete victory for the papacy, the event's consequences were far more complex and did not represent a final resolution. The immediate effect of the papal pardon was to restore Henry's standing within the Church, thereby invalidating the excuse for the German princes to abandon their oaths of fealty. Henry's action, however humiliating, was a calculated political maneuver to regain the moral and religious high ground. By demonstrating his piety, he undermined the legitimacy of the rebellious princes who had been seeking to depose him in favor of an alternate ruler. In Germany, the reaction was mixed. The princes, who had hoped to see the Pope permanently condemn Henry, were frustrated by the reconciliation. They proceeded to elect a rival king, Rudolf of Swabia, in March 1077, plunging the kingdom into a civil war that would last for years. Henry, now absolved, was free to return to Germany and prosecute the war against his domestic opponents. He demonstrated his political resilience and military skill, proving that Canossa had not broken his secular power. The conflict continued as a brutal and protracted struggle for supremacy, with the Pope's excommunication of Henry serving more as a political weapon than an absolute condemnation. The long-term effects of Canossa were profound and reshaped the political structure of the empire. The episode irrevocably altered the balance of power between the emperor and the papacy. It established a powerful precedent that an emperor could be made to submit to the spiritual authority of the Pope. This recognition of papal supremacy, even if temporary, had no parallel in the previous centuries. It fundamentally weakened the imperial concept, eroding the notion of the emperor as a divinely appointed ruler who could stand above the Church's authority. Furthermore, the conflict served to significantly empower the German princes. They had successfully used the papal excommunication as leverage against their emperor, a tactic they would repeat in future disputes. By supporting the Pope, the princes were able to secure more independence and autonomy within their own territories. They gained new privileges and solidified their power bases at the expense of the central monarchy. The struggle for authority shifted from being solely a contest between the emperor and the Pope to a triangular power dynamic that included a newly emboldened German aristocracy. This decentralization was a permanent consequence of the investiture controversy. The eventual compromise of the Concordat of Worms in 1122 formally ended the conflict, but the lasting reordering of political relationships within the empire had already been set in motion. The Holy Roman Emperor's role was no longer that of an unchallenged supreme sovereign, but of a ruler whose authority was now inextricably linked to the consent of both the Church and the powerful German nobles. The long-standing conflict over the right of lay investiture reached its formal conclusion with the Concordat of Worms in 1122. This agreement, negotiated between Emperor Henry V and Pope Calixtus II, was not a surrender by either side, but a carefully crafted compromise that fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the Empire and the Church. Its primary objective was to resolve the decades-long dispute by distinguishing between the spiritual and secular aspects of a bishop's office. The document granted the Church the exclusive right to freely elect and consecrate bishops and abbots. The Church would use the symbols of the ring and crozier to signify this purely spiritual authority, thereby removing the emperor's direct involvement in the ecclesiastical appointments that were so vital to his administrative system. In return for this concession, the emperor retained a significant, albeit symbolic, role in the process. He was granted the right to be present at the election of the bishop, and in cases of disputed results, he could act as an arbiter. This preserved a degree of imperial influence without directly granting the power of appointment. Crucially, the Concordat stipulated that the emperor would invest the new bishop with his secular landholdings, or regalia, by the touch of a scepter. This act, occurring after the spiritual consecration, established the bishop's feudal allegiance to the emperor for their temporal possessions. This dual process formally separated the spiritual and secular spheres of a bishop's authority, a distinction that had previously been blurred. The political consequences of this agreement were profound and far-reaching. The papacy, having successfully fought for its independence from secular control, emerged as a powerful and unified force on the European stage. The Church now had the autonomy to appoint its own officials, strengthening its internal hierarchy and its authority over religious life. The emperor, however, lost a critical instrument of control. The Ottonian system, which had relied on the strategic appointment of loyal bishops as a counterweight to the powerful dukes, was now irrevocably weakened. While the emperor could still influence elections and control the secular lands of the Church, he no longer had the final say over who occupied these key positions. This shift diminished the emperor's ability to maintain a loyal, centralized bureaucracy and contributed to the ongoing decentralization of power within the German kingdom. The Concordat of Worms also set a precedent for future relations between secular and spiritual powers. It codified the idea that temporal and ecclesiastical authority were two separate and distinct realms, each with its own jurisdiction and source of legitimacy. This principle would shape political thought and power dynamics for the rest of the medieval period, as rulers across Europe had to navigate their relationships with a now independent and assertive papacy. While the agreement ended one specific conflict, it created a new framework for competition and cooperation that would continue to define the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The investiture controversy, while resolved with the Concordat of Worms, left the Holy Roman Empire fundamentally and permanently weakened. It was not a victory for either side, but a strategic reordering of power that had profound consequences. Most significantly, the long struggle resulted in the empowerment of the German princes. The conflict between emperor and pope provided a unique opportunity for the German nobility to assert their independence. They had been instrumental in forcing Henry IV to submit at Canossa and had gained a taste of their collective power. By siding with the papacy, they could leverage spiritual authority against the emperor, securing more privileges and landholdings. This dynamic transformed the German kingdom from a nascent centralized monarchy into a collection of semi-autonomous principalities. The princes, now emboldened, consolidated their hereditary rights and increasingly viewed the emperor not as a divinely sanctioned sovereign, but as the first among equals. Furthermore, the conflict irreparably damaged the Ottonian administrative system. This system had been the foundation of imperial power, relying on the strategic appointment of loyal bishops and abbots to control vast territories and provide military support. The Concordat of Worms, by granting the Church the right of free election, removed the emperor's most effective tool for counterbalancing the secular dukes. While the emperor retained some influence through his presence at elections and the investiture of secular lands, he could no longer guarantee the loyalty of the ecclesiastical princes. This forced him to increasingly rely on secular vassals, whose loyalty was often conditional and whose power was passed down through hereditary lines, making them less controllable. The empire's central government, having lost its most reliable administrative base, struggled to exert authority over its vast territory. The political consequence of this shift was a lasting decentralization of power. The emperor's authority became less of a national monarchy and more of a fragile framework of alliances. The crown often passed to different dynasties, as no single family could secure its hold without the full support of the princes. The empire became a complex, fragmented mosaic of duchies, counties, bishoprics, and free cities, each with its own internal interests and agendas. The emperors who followed would be consumed by the dual struggle to maintain their prestige in Italy, while simultaneously trying to contain the growing independence of their German nobles. The investiture controversy, therefore, was not merely a theological dispute, it was a constitutional crisis that permanently altered the internal structure of the Holy Roman Empire, creating the conditions for the political fragmentation that would define its future. Frederick I, better known as Barbarossa for his distinctive red beard, ascended to the throne in 1152 with a clear objective: to reassert the imperial authority that had been significantly diminished since the investiture controversy. He sought to move beyond the limitations imposed by the Concordat of Worms and restore the Holy Roman Empire to a position of universal power. His reign was characterized by a relentless pursuit of this goal, which brought him into direct conflict with two of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe, the independent communes of northern Italy and the Roman papacy. Barbarossa's first step was to assert the legal and political rights of the empire, a concept he championed through his appeal to Roman law. He convened the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158, where jurists from the University of Bologna codified the emperor's imperial prerogatives, or regalia. These rights included the authority to appoint officials, collect tolls, mint currency, and levy taxes. This was a clear attempt to centralize power and dismantle the independent jurisdictions that had emerged, particularly in Italy. The Italian city-states, with their burgeoning economies and fierce desire for autonomy, viewed this as a direct threat to their hard-won freedoms. They had grown wealthy through trade and self-governance, and were unwilling to submit to an emperor they saw as a foreign overlord. This clash of wills led to a series of military campaigns that would consume much of Barbarossa's reign. He led 6 separate expeditions across the Alps into Italy, engaging in brutal and protracted conflicts against a coalition of cities known as the Lombard League. The war was defined by a cycle of imperial sieges, city submissions, and subsequent rebellions. The Italian communes, while individually weaker than the imperial army, proved formidable when united, using their urban fortifications and superior resources to resist imperial authority. The papacy, fearing a powerful emperor who could dominate the entire peninsula, consistently sided with the Lombard League, using its spiritual authority to excommunicate Barbarossa and his supporters. The culmination of these conflicts was the Battle of Legnano in 1176. This was a decisive military defeat for Barbarossa at the hands of the Milanese communal infantry, marking the first time a medieval imperial army was completely routed by a force of common citizens. The loss at Legnano forced the emperor to change his strategy. He was compelled to negotiate, not from a position of strength, but from necessity. This led to the Treaty of Venice in 1177, a landmark agreement that ended the schism with the papacy and recognized the Pope as the head of the Christian world. Barbarossa symbolically knelt before Pope Alexander III, acknowledging the Pope's spiritual supremacy in an act that publicly demonstrated the limits of his secular power. A subsequent peace treaty with the Lombard League in 1183 granted the Italian cities their autonomy while they formally recognized him as their sovereign. While he failed to fully achieve his goal of a centralized, dominant empire, his reign did more than any other to define the imperial idea and establish the lasting power struggles that would shape the empire's future. The wealthy and autonomous city-states of northern Italy presented a formidable challenge to Frederick Barbarossa's imperial ambitions. With their flourishing economies based on trade and a fierce sense of self-governance, these cities had no interest in submitting to the centralized authority he envisioned. In response to his demands for imperial control, they formed the Lombard League in 1167. This was not a loose coalition but a formal military alliance, uniting cities like Milan, Verona, and Cremona in a determined front against the emperor. The League's primary objective was to defend the freedoms they had established, including their right to self-government, local taxation, and the administration of their own justice. The city's power was rooted in their economic prosperity. They were centers of craft production, banking, and international trade, which provided them with the resources to hire mercenaries, build sophisticated fortifications, and equip their own urban militias. Their strategic location along key trade routes to the Holy Roman Empire and across the Mediterranean gave them immense wealth and diplomatic leverage. The League's military tactics were highly advanced for the time, a direct result of their urban and economic resources. They relied on well-trained communal infantry rather than just noble cavalry, and were masters of siege warfare, both in attack and defense. Their strong city walls and moats proved to be a formidable obstacle to Barbarossa's armies, which were more accustomed to open field battles. The Lombard League's resistance was further strengthened by its key alliance with the papacy. The popes, particularly Alexander III, viewed Barbarossa's imperial overreach as a direct threat to their own spiritual and temporal power in Italy. The spectre of a single, powerful emperor controlling the entire peninsula, from Germany to Rome, was unacceptable. Consequently, the popes consistently sided with the League, providing not only diplomatic support, but also the powerful tool of excommunication against the emperor and his followers. This created a dual front for Barbarossa, who had to contend with both a military coalition on the battlefield and a spiritual opponent that could undermine his authority among his own subjects. The protracted conflict with the Lombard League and their papal allies demonstrated the limits of imperial power. Despite leading 6 expeditions into Italy, and often achieving tactical victories, Barbarossa could never secure a permanent submission. His reliance on feudal levies meant his armies could not stay in Italy for extended periods, as the German princes and their vassals had their own lands to tend to. This allowed the cities, with their permanent militias, to regroup and rebel in his absence. The culmination of this struggle was the decisive Battle of Legnano in 1176. The defeat, a humiliation for a monarch who saw himself as a successor to Roman emperors, forced him to acknowledge the League's de facto autonomy in the subsequent peace treaty. The Lombard League, through its unity and military prowess, established a new model for political organization in medieval Europe, proving that urban communes could successfully resist the authority of even the most powerful feudal monarch. The confrontation between Frederick Barbarossa and the Lombard League culminated in a direct military engagement at the Battle of Legnano on the 29th of May 1176. This event, near Milan, was a decisive test of imperial authority against the power of the Italian urban communes. Barbarossa had recently crossed the Alps with a relatively small army, aiming to quickly suppress the Italian rebels. His force was a typical feudal levy, composed primarily of heavily armoured German knights and cavalry, a core of martial prowess. They were experienced in open-field combat, relying on the shock and discipline of their mounted charges to break enemy formations. The Lombard League's army was a reflection of their civic identity and economic power. It was not a feudal host, but a coalition of communal militias, most notably from Milan. The army's core was a mass of well-trained infantry, armed with spears and shields. Their formation was designed to be a solid, immovable phalanx, capable of withstanding cavalry assaults. Central to their battle line was the Carroccio, a massive ox-drawn wagon bearing the city's banner and a crucifix. Its defense was not merely strategic, but a point of profound civic and religious honor, a symbol that the army would hold its ground at all costs. An elite unit of Milanese knights, known as the Company of Death, swore a solemn oath to defend the Carroccio or perish. The battle began with a powerful charge from the imperial cavalry, which successfully broke through the initial Lombard forces. This initial success scattered the League's vanguard, but the disciplined Milanese infantry surrounding the Carroccio held firm. They formed a defensive wall of shields and spears, absorbing the full impact of the imperial charge. The German knights, unable to penetrate the dense formation, were caught in a protracted and costly melee. During this critical engagement, the small but determined Company of Death charged into the heart of the imperial formation, targeting the emperor's standard. Their sudden, desperate attack caused disarray. The pivotal moment occurred when the imperial banner was captured and Barbarossa was unhorsed, disappearing into the chaos of the fighting. His presumed death caused a wave of panic that swept through the imperial ranks. The German army, without its leader and with its sacred banner lost, broke formation and fled in disarray. The Lombard forces, now with the momentum, pursued the fleeing imperial troops, turning the repulse into a rout. Barbarossa was later found alive, but the military defeat was complete. The Battle of Legnano marked a significant and unprecedented victory for a non-feudal army of urban citizens over a professional imperial force. The battlefield outcome had immediate political consequences, as the emperor, unable to continue his military campaigns, was compelled to seek peace on terms that acknowledged the autonomy of the Italian communes. Following the reign of Frederick Barbarossa, the Hohenstaufen ambition to dominate Italy was not abandoned, but intensified by his successors. His son, Henry VI, inherited the imperial throne, and, through his marriage to Constance, the heir to the Norman kingdom of Sicily, brought the entire southern Italian peninsula and Sicily under Hohenstaufen rule. This union represented the culmination of a century of imperial strategy, linking the German heartland directly with the wealthiest and most centralized kingdom in Italy. Henry's rule, however, was brief and marked by brutality in his efforts to consolidate power in his new southern territories. He suppressed local opposition with extreme prejudice, aiming to forge a single, powerful realm from the Alps to the Mediterranean. His sudden death in 1197 left the empire with a child emperor, a situation that immediately led to political chaos and a renewed power struggle between the papacy and the nobility. This power struggle was ultimately resolved by Henry's son, Frederick II. Raised in the sophisticated, multicultural court of Palermo in Sicily, Frederick was more Italian than German. He viewed Sicily as the foundation of his power and ruled it as a modern, centralized kingdom, establishing a sophisticated administration, a standing army, and a comprehensive legal code. He was a polymath and patron of the arts, but his intellectual pursuits did not overshadow his military and political ambition. He sought to impose his direct rule over the entire Italian peninsula, including the Papal States and the independent communes, which he saw as a fragmented obstacle to his universal vision. This relentless ambition led to a prolonged and definitive conflict with the papacy and the resurgent Lombard League. The popes, with their own temporal claims in central Italy, saw the unification of the peninsula under an emperor as an existential threat to their authority and independence. The struggle between Frederick II and the papacy was a bitter and protracted one, characterized by repeated excommunications, counter-invasions, and a long-standing political divide between pro-imperial Ghibellines and pro-papal Guelphs across Italy and Germany. To maintain his focus on Italy and secure his imperial position, Frederick made significant concessions to the German princes. In a series of charters, most notably the Statutum in Favorum Principum of 1232, he granted them extensive autonomy and territorial rights, sacrificing central imperial power in Germany for the sake of his Italian endeavours. This policy, while allowing him to pursue his Italian dreams, effectively dismantled the centralized authority that the Ottonians and early Salians had fought to build. Frederick's reign, for all its brilliance, ended in political and military failure. His death in 1250, followed by the defeat of his successors, marked the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty and the final dissipation of a unified imperial presence in Italy. The constant struggle for control of the peninsula had drained the empire's resources and ultimately left it weaker. The imperial title remained, but the dream of a single, unified realm was abandoned, and power became irrevocably decentralized, shifting to the powerful German princes who had been granted immense concessions to support the Hohenstaufens' failed ambition. The legacy was a hollowed-out imperial authority, an Italy in political chaos, and a German realm with a power structure that would define its political development for centuries. Frederick II, known to his contemporaries as Stupa Mundi, or the Wonder of the World, established a court in Sicily that was unparalleled in medieval Europe. Unlike the feudal courts of his German realm, his administration in the south was a vibrant and intellectual melting pot that drew from the island's unique history. Sicily, a crossroads of civilizations for centuries, had been a crossroads of cultures, with its Norman rulers having governed a predominantly Greek and Arab population. Frederick's genius was to build upon these existing foundations, forging a new sophisticated synthesis that became the foundation of his power. His court at Palermo was not merely a residence, but a bustling centre for learning, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. The administration he developed was a testament to this unique blend. He drew on the highly efficient administrative traditions of the Arab and Byzantine systems, creating a centralized bureaucracy staffed by men chosen for their merit rather than their noble birth. This approach allowed him to implement his authority directly and uniformly across the kingdom. His legal reforms, codified in the constitutions of Melfi in 1231, were a revolutionary set of laws that established the supremacy of royal authority over feudal privilege, providing a comprehensive legal framework for his kingdom. This legal code was influenced by Roman law, showcasing his profound respect for classical jurisprudence. The intellectual climate of his court was unlike any other in Latin Christendom. Frederick, fluent in Latin, Greek, German, and Arabic, was a voracious learner who actively sought out scholars from diverse backgrounds. He brought Arab and Jewish scholars to his court, where they worked alongside Latin and Greek intellectuals. He sponsored translations of Arabic and Greek scientific and philosophical texts, making the knowledge of antiquity and the Islamic world accessible to a European audience. His own interests were wide-ranging, from astronomy and mathematics to philosophy and natural history. He authored his own book, De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, The Art of Hunting with Birds, a scientific treatise on falconry that demonstrated a meticulous, almost modern, approach to observation and classification. This court became a crucible of innovation. Scholars debated the works of Aristotle and Averroes, and new ideas in medicine and optics flourished. The intellectual curiosity that pervaded his court stood in stark contrast to the more rigid and traditionalist academic centers of Northern Europe. However, his sophisticated and often heterodox court lifestyle, combined with his ambition to control the papal states, drew the ire of the Church. The popes viewed him with deep suspicion, seeing his embrace of Islamic and classical learning as a threat to Christian orthodoxy. This cultural and political divide, as much as any military conflict, would define the bitter struggle between the emperor and the papacy, which ultimately contributed to the end of his dynasty and the fragmentation of the empire he had sought to make a universal, unified realm. Frederick II's relentless pursuit of dominance in Italy brought him into a definitive and protracted conflict with the papacy. Unlike his predecessors, Frederick ruled an immense territory that encircled the papal states, extending from Germany through northern Italy and into his inherited kingdom of Sicily in the south. This geographical reality presented a grave existential threat to the popes, who saw their independence and temporal authority imperiled by an emperor who could physically and politically surround them. The papacy's primary objective shifted from merely asserting its spiritual supremacy to ensuring its continued political autonomy as a sovereign entity in central Italy. This struggle, which defined Frederick's reign, was a clash of universal claims. The emperor's assertion of secular dominion over all of Christendom versus the pope's claim to ultimate spiritual and, increasingly, temporal authority. Pope Gregory IX, a staunch opponent of imperial overreach, was the first to openly confront Frederick, excommunicating him in 1227 for delays in launching a crusade, a charge that was as much a pretext for political opposition as a genuine religious grievance. The excommunication was not a singular event, but the first of many such actions, as Gregory and his successors, including Pope Innocent IV, used the full power of their office to undermine the emperor. They declared him a heretic, an antichrist, and a tyrant, absolving his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. This ideological assault transformed the political struggle into a religious crusade against the emperor himself. Frederick responded to these spiritual attacks with political and military force. His campaigns in Italy were aimed not only at subjugating the communes of the Lombard League, but also at directly attacking papal territories. He established imperial administration across northern Italy and repeatedly besieged cities loyal to the Pope. These military operations, while occasionally successful, were enormously costly in terms of manpower and financial resources. The relentless nature of the conflict drained the imperial treasury and required a continuous supply of troops, much of which had to be raised in Germany. This constant diversion of resources and the emperor's long absences from his northern lands created significant internal challenges. The popes in turn used their spiritual authority to foment rebellion in Germany. They actively supported anti-imperial factions among the German princes and clergy, encouraging them to elect a rival to Frederick. This papal policy of endorsing a counter-king created deep and enduring divisions within the German nobility, fracturing the loyalty that had been a hallmark of Hohenstaufen rule. The princes, who had already gained considerable autonomy from Frederick's concessions, leveraged the papal conflict to further consolidate their power and independence. This external pressure and internal fracturing ultimately proved to be an insurmountable obstacle to Frederick's ambitions. His death in 1250, followed by the swift collapse of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, left the empire in a state of political chaos. The relentless conflict with the papacy, while never fully resolving the core ideological questions, had effectively demonstrated the limits of imperial power and cemented the fragmented nature of the German realm for centuries to come. The emperor's long absence. Frederick II's preference for his southern kingdom of Sicily, which he considered his true homeland and the administrative heart of his empire, led to his prolonged neglect of his German territories. He spent more than 3/4 of his reign away from Germany, primarily in the culturally rich and politically intricate landscapes of southern Italy. This physical and political distance created a profound authority vacuum in the northern half of his realm. Unlike the Ottonians and Salians, who had been resident rulers in Germany, Frederick's presence was intermittent, relying on appointed administrators and viceroys to govern in his stead. This system proved to be fundamentally unsustainable. The German princes, ever vigilant for opportunities to expand their influence, were quick to exploit the emperor's absence. With the distant imperial crown unable to directly oversee and enforce its will, the princes began to consolidate their own territorial power. To secure their loyalty and support for his Italian wars, Frederick made a series of significant concessions that systematically dismantled the central imperial authority. The most notable of these was the Statutum in Favorem Principum, Statute in Favor of the Princes, of 1232, which granted the princes almost complete sovereignty within their own domains. This charter gave them exclusive rights over taxation, minting coins, and dispensing justice, effectively turning their territories into independent states. The right to build castles and fortifications, previously an imperial prerogative, was also granted, allowing the princes to create powerful defensive strongholds that challenged any future attempts at imperial centralization. The emperor's reliance on the princes for military and financial support for his campaigns in Italy came at the ultimate cost of his authority in Germany. He was, in essence, trading away the foundations of his power in one realm to pursue an unattainable dream in another. This deliberate policy of delegation resulted in a fundamental and irreversible shift in the power dynamic of the empire. Authority migrated from the imperial crown to the regional princes. These magnates, now possessing judicial, financial, and military control over their territories, no longer viewed the emperor as their direct and undisputed liege lord, but as a distant and increasingly irrelevant figure. Their own courts and administrations grew in sophistication and independence, while the imperial court in Germany atrophied. The decentralization that had been a latent feature of the empire became a permanent and defining characteristic. When the Hohenstaufen dynasty finally collapsed, it left behind a German realm that was not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of hundreds of autonomous states, a political reality that would persist for centuries. The long absence of Frederick II in his quest for an Italian empire ultimately sealed the fate of the German kingdom, transforming it into the politically fragmented and weak entity that would be the defining feature of the later Holy Roman Empire. The death of Frederick II in 1250 initiated the final, irreversible decline of the Hohenstaufen dynasty. His passing did not immediately dissolve the imperial framework, but it removed the central figure who had, for decades, held the empire together through sheer force of will and a network of appointed administrators. The succession was immediately contested. Frederick's son, Conrad IV, inherited the German crown, but he was challenged by a rival king, William of Holland, who was actively supported by the papacy. This division fractured the German nobility and led to a period of internal military and political conflict, as the various factions fought to advance their own interests under the guise of supporting one claimant over the other. Conrad, focused on asserting his authority in Germany, died prematurely in 1254, leaving a young son, Conradin, as the sole heir of the main Hohenstaufen line. Meanwhile, in Italy, the dynasty's fate rested with Frederick's illegitimate son, Manfred. He effectively took control of the Kingdom of Sicily and through military campaigns reasserted Hohenstaufen influence over much of the peninsula. His ambition and military prowess presented a significant threat to the papacy, which saw in him a new version of his father's relentless drive for dominance. To counter this, Pope Urban IV offered the crown of Sicily to Charles of Anjou, a younger brother of the French king Louis IX. The ensuing war was a direct proxy conflict that would decide the fate of both the Hohenstaufen line and papal independence in Italy. The climax of this struggle came at the Battle of Benevento in 1266. In a decisive engagement, Charles of Anjou's French and Italian forces defeated and killed Manfred, effectively ending the Hohenstaufen presence in the south. The last hope for the dynasty rested on the young Conradin, who at just 15 years old crossed the Alps with a small army in a final, desperate attempt to reclaim his family's Italian patrimony. He was initially met with some support, but was ultimately defeated by Charles of Anjou at the Battle of Tagliacozzo in 1268. Conradin was captured and, in an act of unprecedented cruelty, was publicly executed in Naples. His death extinguished the male line of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, a decisive end to their imperial ambitions. The collapse of the Hohenstaufen house left a profound political vacuum in the empire, a period known as the Great Interregnum, 1254 to 1273. With no legitimate or powerful monarch to rule, the empire's structure disintegrated. The German princes, no longer constrained by a strong emperor, ceased to elect a single, effective ruler. Instead, they chose a series of weak, short-reigned monarchs from minor princely families, such as Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso X of Castile, who had little interest in or ability to govern the German realm. These so-called shadow emperors were unable to enforce imperial law, settle disputes, or collect taxes. Power devolved to the local level, allowing the princes to act as sovereigns within their territories, building their own bureaucracies, and forging their own alliances. This period of sustained chaos cemented the decentralized nature of the empire, ensuring that from that point forward, the imperial title would be more of an honorific than a source of true centralized power. The age of a universal hegemonic emperor was over, replaced by a complex and fractious political landscape. The period following the death of Conrad IV in 1254, which marked the effective end of the Hohenstaufen imperial line, descended into profound political chaos known as the Great Interregnum. For nearly 2 decades, the Holy Roman Empire lacked a single, universally recognized or effective monarch. The German princes, who held the right of election, used this power to their own advantage, choosing a series of weak claimants who were unable to assert any meaningful authority over the fragmented realm. The most prominent of these were Richard of Cornwall, a wealthy English magnate, and Alfonso X of Castile, a Spanish king with a distant imperial claim. Neither man had a significant power base in Germany, nor did they possess the resources or political will to enforce their rule. Their reigns were brief and characterized by a complete absence of imperial governance. This vacuum of centralized power had immediate and lasting consequences. The disintegration of the imperial court meant that the mechanisms for resolving disputes between princes, cities, and ecclesiastical territories vanished. Without a supreme judicial authority, conflicts were settled through private feuds and military force. This led to a period of sustained internal warfare and instability across the German lands. In the absence of imperial protection, cities and leagues began to organize their own defenses and forge independent alliances. The Rhine League and the Hanseatic League, for example, grew in prominence during this era, building their own military forces and establishing their own legal codes to protect their commercial interests. These urban alliances became powerful political actors in their own right, a direct result of the emperor's impotence. For the German princes, the interregnum was a period of immense opportunity. Unconstrained by a monarch who could challenge their authority, they became de facto sovereign rulers within their own domains. They built fortresses, raised their own armies, minted their own coins, and collected tolls, all rights that had previously been the prerogative of the emperor. The major princely houses, such as the Wittelsbachs and the Habsburgs, used this time to expand their territorial holdings and consolidate their dynastic power. They systematically absorbed smaller lordships and extinguished the rights of lesser nobility, creating the large, cohesive principalities that would form the political map of Germany for centuries. The papacy also exploited the interregnum, gaining influence over German affairs by throwing its support behind favoured claimants and consistently opposing any strong monarch who might attempt to revive the old Hohenstaufen Universalist agenda. The election of Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273 marked the formal end of this period of lawlessness, but it could not reverse the fundamental shift in power. The age of a universal emperor with a strong German power base was over. From this point on, the Holy Roman Empire was a loose confederation of independent states. with the imperial title becoming more of an honorific and a tool for dynastic expansion than a true source of central power. The interregnum had cemented the decentralized and fragmented nature of the empire, a political reality that would endure until its final dissolution. The protracted chaos of the interregnum had a transformative effect on the constitutional structure of the Holy Roman Empire. With the imperial office powerless, the German princely states systematically consolidated their authority, turning their territories into cohesive, semi-independent realms. The princes, who had initially benefited from imperial concessions, now operated without any meaningful oversight. This period was not merely a pause in central governance, but a fundamental and irreversible transfer of power from the imperial throne to the regional magnates. They seized the opportunity to exercise rights and privileges that had long been theoretical imperial prerogatives, solidifying their status as true rulers within their own domains. One of the most significant shifts was the establishment of independent legal systems. Without a supreme imperial court to resolve disputes, the princes established their own high courts, effectively becoming the ultimate judicial authority for their subjects. This allowed them to enforce their own edicts and codes, bypassing the fragmented and unreliable imperial justice system. This jurisdictional control was a cornerstone of their new sovereignty. Furthermore, they gained full control over fiscal policy. They levied their own taxes, tolls on key trade routes, and customs duties on goods passing through their lands. This financial independence provided them with the resources necessary to build sophisticated territorial administrations and fund their own military forces. The ability to mint their own coins, an exclusive symbol of sovereignty, also became widespread during this period. The military fragmentation of the empire was equally profound. The princes raised their own standing armies and constructed a vast network of fortified castles and strongholds without imperial permission. These military assets allowed them to defend their borders, enforce their will on the lesser nobility, and wage war against their rivals without fear of imperial intervention. The concept of a unified imperial army, once a reality under the Ottonians, was now a fiction. The emperor could only hope to raise an army by appealing to the princes for their own troops, a request that could be refused or negotiated on terms favourable to the princes themselves. The political landscape that emerged from this era was not a cohesive kingdom, but a confederation of states. Each principality, duchy, and city, while still nominally part of the empire, was in practice a distinct political entity with its own foreign policy and internal governance. The imperial title, once the source of supreme authority, was now a largely ceremonial position, sought not for its power over the princes, but for the prestige and diplomatic leverage it provided. The rise of the princely states, therefore, was the defining legacy of the interregnum. It established the decentralized, multi-state structure that would characterize the Holy Roman Empire until its final dissolution centuries later. The political chaos of the Great Interregnum underscored the need for a more stable and definitive imperial election process. In response to this decades-long instability, Emperor Charles IV issued the Golden Bull of 1356, a landmark constitutional document that codified the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. This document was the most significant legal act in the empire's history, and it formally established the preeminent power of a select group of princes. Its name derived from the Golden Seal, or bulla, affixed to the original document. The Golden Bull established a fixed college of 7 electors who would henceforth be responsible for choosing the monarch. This college consisted of 3 ecclesiastical princes and 4 secular ones. The ecclesiastical electors were the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, who, in addition to their spiritual authority, controlled vast and wealthy territories. Their inclusion ensured the Church's continued, but now regulated, role in the imperial process. The secular electors were the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These 7 individuals were given formal and exclusive authority over the election, eliminating the chaotic and often violent struggles between rival princes that had defined the past. The document meticulously outlined the procedures for the election. It specified that the election was to be held in Frankfurt within 3 months of an emperor's death. The Archbishop of Mainz was designated as the convener of the college and a crucial figure in the process. The election was to be decided by a majority vote, a crucial detail that removed the need for a unanimous consensus and streamlined the process, ensuring a more rapid and decisive outcome. The Golden Bull also declared the imperial electors to be sovereign rulers within their own territories. They were granted a number of exclusive privileges, including the right to mint their own coins and exercise supreme jurisdiction without appeal to a higher court. This provision legally recognized the de facto independence that the princes had secured during the interregnum, making their territorial rule a matter of constitutional law. The political consequences of the Golden Bull were far-reaching and enduring. It definitively shifted the balance of power within the empire, away from the emperor and toward the princes. The imperial office became an elected position, and the 7 electors were elevated to a status of unparalleled influence and prestige. The document was a victory for the princely class, and a defeat for the centralizing ambitions of the monarchy. It did not, however, create a unified German state. Instead, it provided a constitutional framework for a fragmented and decentralized empire. The document's longevity is a testament to its effectiveness in creating a stable, albeit decentralized political system that would endure until the empire's final dissolution. The religious reform movement of Jan Hus, a theologian from Bohemia, ignited a new and profound challenge to the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. Huss's teachings, inspired by the English reformer John Wycliffe, critiqued what he saw as the moral decay of the Catholic Church. He advocated for communion in both bread and wine for the laity, and criticized the sale of indulgences and simony, gaining a broad following among the Bohemian populace, who were also deeply resentful of German influence. His defiance of church authority led to his condemnation as a heretic. In 1415, at the Council of Constance, Huss was promised safe conduct, but was instead arrested, put on trial, and burned at the stake. His death was a political miscalculation of the highest order. Far from extinguishing the movement, the execution of Huss sparked a nationwide rebellion. The Bohemian people rose up, and the Hussite Wars began, transforming a theological dispute into a protracted military and political conflict that would last for nearly 2 decades. The Hussites organized into 2 primary factions: the moderate Utraquists, who sought limited religious reforms and recognition of their practices, and the radical Taborites, who desired a complete break from the established church and a more egalitarian social order. Emperor Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, responded by launching a series of crusades against the Hussites, viewing their rebellion as a direct challenge to both his spiritual and temporal authority. The imperial military response was a series of abject failures that exposed the empire's fundamental weaknesses. The imperial armies were not a unified force, but a loosely coordinated coalition of troops raised by the various princes, bishops, and imperial cities. This lack of centralized command and cohesive strategy was a critical liability. In contrast, the Hussites proved to be highly disciplined and innovative fighters. Under the brilliant command of blind General Jan Žižka, they perfected a novel defensive tactic known as the Wagenburg, or wagon fort. These mobile fortifications, composed of fortified wagons chained together, created an impregnable perimeter that could withstand the charges of heavily armored imperial cavalry. The Hussites' use of handguns and field cannons from within these wagon circles gave them a technological advantage that consistently routed the crusading armies. The emperor's consistent inability to suppress the rebellion demonstrated that the imperial title held little practical authority over the German princes. Repeated crusades were launched with great fanfare but little success, draining the empire's coffers and demoralizing its nobility. The Bohemian princes and nobles, exploiting the emperor's failures, secured greater autonomy from central rule. The conflict was eventually resolved by a political compromise known as the Compact of Prague, which granted the Utraquists recognition within the church. The wars did not lead to a formal separation from the empire, but they did leave Bohemia with a unique religious and political identity, further highlighting the decentralized nature of the empire. The military and financial exhaustion from the Hussite wars left the empire weakened, and its constituent parts more independent than ever. The tumultuous period of the Great Interregnum drew to a close with the election of Rudolf I of Habsburg in 1273. He was chosen not for his immense power, but precisely because the powerful electors viewed him as a weak, compromise candidate who would not pose a threat to their newfound autonomy. Rudolf was merely a count of modest lands in what is now Switzerland, a stark contrast to the mighty Hohenstaufen emperors. However, his election marked a pivotal moment in the history of the empire, as it began the rise of a dynasty that would eventually dominate the imperial throne for centuries. The Habsburgs' genius lay not in military conquest or political centralization of the entire empire, but in a relentless focus on consolidating their own hereditary lands. Rudolf's primary accomplishment was the strategic acquisition of Austria. After defeating King Ottokar II of Bohemia in 1278, he confiscated the duchies of Austria and Styria as imperial fiefs and granted them to his own sons. This move, which was seen as a blatant abuse of his imperial office, provided the Habsburgs with a rich and strategically located territorial base. Austria became the heart of their dynastic power, giving them the financial resources and manpower that their predecessors had lacked. Subsequent Habsburg rulers would expand upon this foundation through a calculated policy of favorable marriage alliances, famously summarized by the motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." This shift in strategy profoundly altered the character of the empire. The imperial crown, once the ultimate goal of the great German dynasties, became an instrument for advancing the interests of a single princely house. Unlike the Ottonian or Salian emperors who sought to build a centralized kingdom with the imperial office, the Habsburgs used the prestige of the crown to secure strategic marriages and expand their territorial domains. They viewed the decentralized nature of the empire not as a weakness to be overcome, but as a system to be manipulated for their own dynastic gain. This approach culminated in the 15th century, when the imperial throne became a near hereditary possession of the Habsburg family. After the election of Frederick III in 1452, a Habsburg held the title almost without interruption until the empire's end. The empire therefore ceased to function as a pan-European monarchy with universal claims. It was transformed into a collection of semi-independent princely states, with the imperial office serving as a tool for the dominant dynasty's foreign and domestic policy. The Habsburgs' focus on consolidating their own domains meant that they often neglected the broader needs of the empire. This lack of a strong central government and the emperor's preoccupation with their dynastic lands ensured that the empire would remain a decentralized and fragmented political entity. The rise of the Habsburgs, therefore, solidified the empire's unique, decentralized structure, a far cry from the centralized universal monarchy envisioned by its founders. As the Holy Roman Empire evolved from a monarchy into a complex constellation of territories, new institutions were required to manage its increasingly fragmented political structure. This growing complexity was addressed through the formalization of the imperial diet and the establishment of the imperial circles. These two institutions, while serving as a framework for governance, also provided a crucial platform for the empire's constituent states to assert their collective interests against imperial authority. They represent a paradox, a move toward order that ultimately reinforced decentralization. The imperial diet, or Reichstag, was a legislative and consultative assembly of the empire. It was not a parliament in the modern sense, but a body where the three main estates of the empire, the electors, the princes, and the representatives of the free imperial cities, could meet and deliberate. Its origins were in the informal gatherings of nobles, but by the late Middle Ages it had become a regular, formal institution. The Diet's functions were vast and critical. It was responsible for declaring wars, ratifying peace treaties, levying imperial taxes, and creating new laws for the entire empire. Yet, The Diet was not a tool for the emperor to impose his will. Instead, it was a forum for negotiation and compromise. Each state, from the great duchies to the smallest free city, had a voice and a vested interest in the outcome. The emperor, while presiding over the assembly, had to secure the consent of the estates to pass any significant legislation or raise funds. In a further attempt to streamline administration and defense, the empire was divided into regional administrative bodies known as the imperial circles, or Reichskreis. Established in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, these were not based on traditional feudal lines, but were practical, functional groupings of states. The primary purpose of the circles was to enforce imperial law, maintain public peace, and provide a system for military coordination. Each circle had its own assembly, where representatives from the member states would meet to address local issues and organize a military quota for the imperial army. This was a crucial reform, as it created a new layer of regional governance that bypassed the direct and often ineffective authority of the emperor. However, just as the Diet gave the princes a voice on a national level, the circles gave them a framework for cooperation on a regional one. The princes and cities within each circle often used this structure to advance their own interests. They mobilized their own troops for local defense, bypassing imperial military command and strengthening their regional autonomy. They also used the circles to oppose the emperor's policies, organizing a united front against unpopular imperial decrees or tax levies. These institutions, therefore, did not lead to a more centralized empire. They formalized its decentralized nature, providing a constitutional stage where the competing interests of the emperor and the princes could be debated. The result was an empire that was less a single state, and more of a complex system of checks and balances, where the emperor ruled through negotiation rather than absolute command. Maximilian I, who reigned as Holy Roman Emperor from 1493 to 1519, was a figure who embodied the contradictions of his time. He was a Renaissance prince with an encyclopedic interest in art, science, and learning, yet he embraced the ideals of medieval chivalry, earning him the moniker the Last Knight. His reign was a period of intense institutional reform and military innovation, driven by a powerful ambition to restore the imperial office to its former glory. He recognized that the empire's weakness stemmed from its decentralized nature and sought to create a more cohesive and effective state. Maximilian's most significant achievement was his effort at imperial reform, or Reichsreform. He understood that the old piecemeal legal system was a major source of internal conflict. To address this, he established the Imperial Chamber Court in 1495, a supreme court intended to serve as a final arbiter for disputes between the princes and to enforce a perpetual public peace, Juga Landfriede, throughout the empire. This was a direct attempt to centralize judicial authority and reduce the endemic feuding that plagued the realm. He also introduced the common penny, a new form of imperial tax designed to provide a steady revenue stream for imperial military campaigns and administrative costs. This was a radical concept for an empire that had always relied on the voluntary contributions of its constituent states. His military innovations were equally forward-thinking. He was among the first rulers to systematically adopt and perfect the tactics of the Swiss pikeman, and organized his own units of professional mercenary infantry, known as the Landsknechte. These disciplined, well-equipped foot soldiers were a direct answer to the dominance of mounted knights and revolutionized warfare in Europe. Maximilian was a key figure in the transition from medieval to modern military practices, leveraging both gunpowder artillery and mass infantry formations to achieve battlefield dominance. Despite his tireless efforts, Maximilian's reforms were consistently hampered by a lack of financial resources. The common penny was widely resisted by the German princes, who were unwilling to cede their fiscal autonomy to the emperor. They viewed his reform efforts as a threat to their sovereignty and used their power in the imperial diet to obstruct his initiatives. The political ambitions of the German princes were now so entrenched that they were a permanent and formidable obstacle to any form of imperial centralization. Maximilian's dynastic policies, centered on a series of brilliant Habsburg marriages, were ultimately more successful than his attempts at internal reform. The marriages of his children and grandchildren would expand the Habsburg territories into Spain, the Netherlands, and Hungary, creating a vast network of personal possessions that would become the foundation of his successor's power. In the end, Maximilian's attempts to transform the empire from within largely failed. He succeeded in formalizing institutions like the imperial diet and circles, but these bodies ultimately served to solidify the power of the princes rather than the emperor. The central paradox of his reign was that his forward-looking reforms were undone by the very decentralized system he was trying to fix. His legacy, therefore, is a mix of revolutionary ambition and political impotence. A monarch who saw the future but was unable to fully bring it to fruition. The early 16th century witnessed widespread social and economic turmoil across the Holy Roman Empire, creating a fertile ground for conflict. The rural population, particularly in southern and central Germany, faced escalating burdens under an archaic feudal system. Lords imposed new taxes and fees, demanding additional labor services and restricting traditional rights to common lands, hunting, and timber. This systemic erosion of customary rights, combined with rising population pressures and crop failures, pushed the peasantry to a breaking point. The profound discontent of the peasantry found a powerful new voice and a new set of justifications in the ideas of the Reformation. The writings of Martin Luther, particularly his concept of Christian freedom and his challenge to traditional church hierarchy, resonated deeply with the common people. While Luther's theology was primarily spiritual, the peasantry interpreted his call to a more direct relationship with God as a blueprint for social and political liberation. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, the right to elect their own pastors, and a reduction in feudal obligations, articulating their grievances in documents like the 12 Articles of Memmingen. This text became a foundational manifesto for the rebels, outlining their demands within a framework of Christian justice. Despite Luther's later condemnation of their radical actions, his initial critiques of authority had already provided the necessary intellectual fuel for the revolt. The revolt erupted in 1524 and spread rapidly, becoming a massive, uncoordinated uprising. Unlike previous localized revolts, this was a multi-regional movement, with peasant armies forming in Swabia, Franconia, Thuringia, and the Rhineland. The rebellion, however, was unified by a shared sense of grievance rather than a central command structure. The peasant armies were often poorly armed and lacked a cohesive military strategy, their ranks swelled by artisans and minor nobles sympathetic to their cause. Their primary objective was not the overthrow of the social order, but a return to what they saw as a just Christian society, free from oppressive burdens. They were met, however, with a swift and overwhelming response. The German princes, regardless of their own religious affiliations, united to brutally suppress the uprising. They organized formidable military forces, most notably through the Swabian League, and hired professional mercenaries. The peasants, despite their numbers, were no match for the disciplined and well-equipped armies of the princes. In a series of decisive battles, most notably at Frankenhausen in 1525, the peasant armies were massacred. The total death toll of the rebellion is estimated to be over 100,000, and the retribution that followed was severe. Castles and towns were retaken, rebel leaders were executed, and the surviving peasantry was subjected to even harsher conditions. The suppression of the Peasants' War had lasting consequences for the empire. It fundamentally cemented the power of the princes, who had demonstrated their military and political dominance as the sole enforcers of order. The emperor, occupied with wars against France and the Ottoman Turks, was largely absent from the conflict, and his failure to act as a protector of the common people confirmed that real power lay with the territorial rulers. The outcome solidified the political divisions of the empire and ensured that any future political or religious change would have to be negotiated through the princely states, not the imperial crown. The early 16th century, a time of profound internal religious conflict within the Holy Roman Empire, was also a period of immense external threat. The Ottoman Empire, a formidable military and political power, was in a period of relentless expansion into Europe. Its advance was not a mere series of raids, but a systematic conquest aimed at establishing permanent control over the Balkans and Central Europe. This presented the Holy Roman Empire with an existential challenge that demanded a unified, coordinated military response, yet the empire's own internal divisions prevented it from doing so effectively. The primary frontier of this conflict was the Kingdom of Hungary, a crucial buffer state for the empire. The Ottoman conquest of Hungary was punctuated by a series of decisive battles, most notably the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian army was annihilated and its king killed. This victory opened the door for the Ottomans to advance directly on imperial territories. The ultimate objective of the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was nothing less than the conquest of Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg monarchy and a symbolic centre of Christian Europe. The fall of Vienna would have shattered the balance of power and opened the heart of Germany to Ottoman conquest. The siege of Vienna in 1529 was the high point of this Ottoman threat. A massive Ottoman army, estimated at over 100,000 men, laid siege to the city for several weeks. The city's defense, however, was a testament to the resilience of a unified effort. The garrison, a mix of imperial, Bohemian and Spanish troops, was led by experienced commanders who used the city's strong fortifications and their superior artillery to withstand the Ottoman assault. The siege was ultimately unsuccessful, as the Ottomans were forced to withdraw due to a combination of determined resistance, supply chain issues, and the onset of winter weather. The siege highlighted a fundamental truth about the Holy Roman Empire. Its survival depended on unity against a common external foe. It was an object lesson in collective defense. Yet, this fragile unity was not born of political consensus, but out of existential fear. While the Ottoman threat was a powerful argument for imperial reform and a more centralized government, the internal religious divisions that were emerging at the same time were an even more powerful force for fragmentation. The conflict between the Catholic states and the newly formed Protestant principalities made it nearly impossible to raise a coordinated imperial army. The Protestant princes were often suspicious of the emperor's motives, fearing that he would use a war against the Turks as a pretext to consolidate his power and suppress the Reformation. The emperor, Charles V, was continually forced to choose between confronting the Ottoman threat and addressing the internal religious schism. This strategic dilemma was crippling. The Ottoman advance, while a constant military burden, paradoxically helped preserve the political stalemate in Germany. The emperor could not risk a full-scale military campaign against the Protestant princes while the Turks were at his gates, and the princes could not fully break from the empire while they needed imperial protection from the east. The Turkish threat, therefore, was both a unifying force and a constant reminder of the empire's fundamental lack of cohesion. Its presence on the eastern frontier shaped imperial policy for decades, yet the empire's failure to present a truly united front against it confirmed the reality of its political fragmentation. The posting of the 95 Theses by Martin Luther in 1517 was not merely a theological debate, but an event that ignited a religious and political revolution that would irrevocably shatter the unity of the Holy Roman Empire. The grievances outlined by the Augustinian friar, particularly his condemnation of the sale of indulgences, resonated with a populace that was already questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. This was not a localized protest. The advent of the printing press allowed Luther's ideas to spread with unprecedented speed across the German lands. Pamphlets, sermons, and his translated Bible made his message accessible to both the learned and the common people, creating a powerful new movement known as Protestantism. The Emperor, Charles V, who was a devout Catholic and a staunch defender of the universal authority of the papacy, was immediately faced with a crisis of unprecedented scale. He viewed the Protestant movement not only as a theological heresy, but as a direct threat to the political and religious order of his empire. The concept of one emperor, one faith, which had been the theoretical foundation of the empire, was now challenged by a schism that divided his subjects along confessional lines. This was more than a religious dispute. It was a political conflict that pitted the imperial center against the territorial states that were embracing the new faith. The rapid spread of Protestantism created a deep and violent division that pitted princes against the emperor and German against German. Many of the German princes, already wary of imperial centralization, saw an opportunity in the Reformation to assert their own authority. By converting to Protestantism, they could seize the vast wealth of the church within their territories, appoint their own clergy, and free themselves from the ecclesiastical and political control of Rome. The creation of the Schmalkaldic League in 1531, a defensive alliance of Protestant princes, was a clear act of defiance against the emperor. The political landscape of the empire became a patchwork of Catholic and Protestant states, each with its own foreign policy and military ambitions. The conflict that followed was marked by a series of political maneuvers, failed compromises, and outright military clashes. Charles V, burdened by wars against France and the Ottoman Empire, was unable to bring his full military might to bear on the German Protestants until the 1542. The Schmalkaldic War of 1546 to 1547, a brief but brutal conflict, saw an imperial victory but failed to crush the Protestant movement. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 was a temporary truce that provided a legal framework for this new reality, establishing the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. This landmark agreement formally recognized Protestantism and granted each ruler the right to choose the religion of their state. The Reformation, therefore, was not merely a religious event, it was a fundamental catalyst for the political fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire. It created a deep and violent division that permanently undermined the emperor's authority. The princes, now heads of their own territorial churches, and with their sovereignty legally recognized by the empire, were more powerful than ever. The old idea of a unified Christian empire was gone, replaced by a complex confederation of states bound together by a fragile and often violated compromise. The empire would never again be truly unified. The reign of Charles V was defined by a unique and unprecedented burden. He inherited not only the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but a vast collection of territories that made him the most powerful monarch in Europe since Charlemagne. His domain included the Spanish kingdoms, with their newly acquired wealth from the Americas, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, and the Habsburg hereditary lands of Austria. This immense geographical reach, however, did not translate into unified power. Instead, it created a multiplicity of enemies and a constant state of political distraction that prevented him from effectively dealing with the single greatest threat to his authority, the Protestant Reformation. Charles was a staunch Catholic, and his primary ideological goal was the preservation of a unified Christendom. He viewed Martin Luther not merely as a heretic, but as a direct challenge to the divinely sanctioned imperial office he held. The concept of one empire, one faith, was central to his worldview, yet he was continuously hampered by conflicts on multiple fronts. For much of his reign, he was locked in a bitter struggle with the ambitious French monarchy under Francis I. This rivalry, fought over control of Italy and the Low Countries, drained his military and financial resources, and often forced him to make concessions to the Protestant princes to secure their military support against the French. Simultaneously, the Ottoman Empire represented a relentless external threat. Their naval presence in the Mediterranean and their territorial expansion into Hungary and the Balkans consumed his attention and required massive military mobilization. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, a pivotal moment of the era, demonstrated the scale of this threat. While the city was successfully defended, the Ottoman advance was a constant reminder that the empire could not afford a full-scale civil war against its own Protestant subjects. The princes, aware of this strategic dilemma, leveraged the Turkish threat to demand greater autonomy and religious tolerance in exchange for their military contributions. The immense scale of Charles's possessions also created a logistical and administrative nightmare. He was an emperor in constant motion, travelling from Spain to Germany, from Italy to the Netherlands, attempting to personally govern his sprawling dominions. His long absences from Germany allowed the local princes to consolidate their power. They established their own territorial administrations, collected their own taxes, and formed their own military alliances, such as the Schmalkaldic League, openly defying imperial authority. The financial resources pouring in from the Americas were often funneled into his wars against France and the Ottomans, leaving little for the administration of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Ultimately, Charles V's reign was a tragic study in the limits of power. He was an emperor who held the fate of Europe in his hands, yet he was unable to achieve his most cherished goal, the suppression of the Reformation and the restoration of a unified Christian empire. The burdens of his vast inherited territories and the relentless foreign enemies they brought with them left him unable to focus on the internal crisis of Germany. His final act of abdicating his titles and dividing his empire between his brother Ferdinand and his son Philip II was a clear admission of his failure to govern such a sprawling and fractured realm. His legacy was not one of consolidation, but of irreversible division. The theological and political divisions that had simmered for decades within the Holy Roman Empire erupted into open military conflict in 1546. This confrontation, known as the Schmalkaldic War, pitted the Protestant princes of the Schmalkaldic League against the forces of Emperor Charles V. The conflict was a long-awaited military reckoning for Charles V, who for years had been unable to bring his full power to bear on the German Protestants due to his engagement with external foes. His primary strategic objective was not merely to win battles, but to restore imperial authority and religious unity by crushing the Protestant movement once and for all. Charles V was able to turn his full attention to the German problem after concluding a temporary peace with France and a truce with the Ottoman Empire. His military campaign was swift and methodical. He sought to isolate the individual members of the League and prevent them from uniting their forces. The Catholic forces were comprised of a diverse army of imperial troops, Spanish regiments, and mercenaries, giving the emperor a significant advantage in terms of professional soldiers and military technology. The Protestant princes, while numerous, lacked a unified command structure and a consistent military strategy. The decisive moment of the war occurred at the Battle of Mühlberg in April 1547. In a swift and overwhelming victory, Charles V's army routed the forces of the Schmalkaldic League, which had been caught attempting to cross the Elbe River. The defeat was a catastrophic blow for the Protestant cause. The two principal leaders of the League, John Frederick I of Saxony and Philip I of Hesse, were captured. With their military leadership in captivity and their armies defeated, the League was effectively dissolved. Charles V's triumph seemed complete. His authority was apparently restored, and the Protestant movement appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Following his military victory, Charles V attempted to enforce a religious settlement known as the Augsburg Interim in 1548. This decree aimed to temporarily reconcile religious differences by forcing Protestants to readopt a series of Catholic practices until a general council could meet. However, the interim was widely unpopular and was viewed by Protestants as a tyrannical imposition. It was met with widespread resistance and failed to achieve the religious unity the emperor had sought. Instead of restoring order, it fueled a new wave of opposition and led to renewed armed conflict. The war, though a clear military victory for Charles V, was a strategic failure. He had demonstrated that he could defeat the Protestant armies on the battlefield, but he could not force them to abandon their faith. The suppression of the movement by force proved impossible, as the Reformation had become too deeply rooted in the political and social fabric of the empire. The ultimate outcome of the conflict was not the restoration of imperial authority, but the confirmation that the empire was irrevocably divided. The Schmalkaldic War ultimately paved the way for the Peace of Augsburg, a negotiated compromise that formally recognized the confessional divisions of the empire and signaled the end of Charles V's dream of a unified Christendom. The protracted religious and military conflicts that followed the Reformation culminated in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. This landmark agreement was a direct result of the political and military stalemate that had exhausted the resources of both the Catholic and Protestant sides. The Emperor, Ferdinand I, acting on behalf of his brother Charles V, who was on the verge of abdicating, sought to establish a legal framework for coexistence that would prevent a total collapse of the imperial structure. The primary and most significant principle enshrined in the treaty was cuius regio, eius religio, or whose realm, his religion. This principle granted each territorial ruler within the Holy Roman Empire the right to choose either Catholicism or Lutheranism as the official confession for their state. The subjects of that state were bound to follow the religion of their prince. While this did not grant individual freedom of worship, it offered a legal escape clause. Those who did not adhere to their ruler's chosen faith were given the right to emigrate to a territory that shared their beliefs. This provision was a pragmatic compromise that acknowledged the new reality of a religiously divided empire. The peace agreement formally ended the legal status of Catholicism as the single, universal faith in the German lands, a monumental shift in the empire's identity. The Peace of Augsburg was, however, far from a comprehensive solution. It legalized the confessional schism, but in doing so, it also formalized the political fragmentation of the empire. The emperor's authority was now permanently limited by the religious choices of his princes. A powerful political religious identity was created at the regional level, giving princes a new source of sovereignty independent of the imperial crown. The religious unity that had been the theoretical foundation of the Holy Roman Empire was definitively replaced by a system of territorial sovereignty. The treaty also intentionally excluded all other Protestant denominations, most notably Calvinism, which had a growing following. This omission left a significant portion of the population without legal protection and created a deep-seated tension that would contribute to future conflict. A further point of contention was the reservatum ecclesiasticum, or the ecclesiastical reservation. This clause stipulated that any Catholic prelate who converted to Protestantism after 1552 would have to forfeit his ecclesiastical lands and titles. This was a crucial provision for the Catholic side, as it prevented the massive transfer of wealth and power from the Church to the Protestant princes. However, it was never formally accepted by the Protestant states, and its ambiguous status was a constant source of friction. The Peace of Augsburg, therefore, did not truly end the religious wars. It merely put them on hold. It established a fragile and often violated compromise that legalized the divisions that had already occurred, setting the stage for more than half a century of political and religious maneuvering that would ultimately culminate in the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Augsburg, a negotiated settlement intended to resolve the religious schism, ultimately proved to be a fragile and temporary compromise. While it brought an end to open hostilities for a time, it failed to address the deep-seated political and theological tensions that were fermenting beneath the surface of the empire. The agreement's most significant flaw was its narrow scope. It only recognized two confessions, Catholicism and Lutheranism, completely excluding other Protestant denominations, most notably Calvinism. This omission was not a minor oversight. Calvinism, with its vigorous missionary zeal and strict theological doctrine, was spreading rapidly throughout the Holy Roman Empire, gaining adherents among influential princes and cities. This created a new layer of religious and political opposition that was not bound by the terms of the treaty, setting the stage for future conflict. Simultaneously, the Counter-Reformation was gaining momentum. The Catholic Church, having recovered from the initial shock of the Protestant challenge, initiated a period of aggressive reform and renewed fervour. The Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563, reasserted Catholic doctrine and revitalized the Church's administrative and spiritual authority. The rise of new religious orders, most notably the Jesuits, provided a highly educated and militant arm for the Catholic cause. These developments led to a renewed campaign to reclaim lands and populations that had been lost to Protestantism. This pushback created a direct and often violent clash with the Protestant princes, who were unwilling to cede their newfound religious and political sovereignty. The ongoing struggle between the Habsburg emperors and the German princes also continued unabated. The emperors, despite their vast territorial possessions, were largely unable to enforce their will over the increasingly independent princes. The imperial diet, once a vehicle for imperial governance, had devolved into a contentious arena for political and religious maneuvering. The princes used this forum to defend their newfound autonomy, passing resolutions and forming alliances that directly challenged imperial authority. The issue of ecclesiastical lands remained a particularly vexing point of contention. The Reservatum Ecclesiasticum from the Peace of Augsburg, which stated that any Catholic bishop who converted to Protestantism must forfeit their land, was a constant source of friction. Its ambiguous legal status led to countless disputes and minor military engagements, as both sides sought to gain control over these rich and strategically important territories. The combination of these factors, the exclusion of Calvinism, the renewed militancy of the Counter-Reformation, and the unresolved political struggle between emperor and princes, created a highly volatile situation. The empire became a political and religious powder keg, with each side stockpiling arms and preparing for a war that seemed inevitable. All that was needed was a catalyst. The Habsburg emperors were determined to restore religious unity, while the Protestant princes were equally resolved to protect their religious freedom and territorial sovereignty. The final, catastrophic war that would erupt in Bohemia was not an unexpected event, but the culmination of decades of unresolved tensions and a breakdown of a deeply flawed political system. The religious and political tensions that had been festering for decades in the Holy Roman Empire found their catalyst in the Kingdom of Bohemia. The Bohemian crown, held by the Catholic Habsburgs, was in constant friction with its largely Protestant nobility. A key point of contention was the Letter of Majesty, a royal charter granted by Emperor Rudolf II in 1609 that had guaranteed religious freedom and a measure of self-governance to the Bohemian estates. The new emperor, Ferdinand II, a devout Catholic and an ardent supporter of the Counter-Reformation, was determined to roll back these concessions. His absolutist policies and his close relationship with the Jesuits were viewed by the Bohemian Protestants as a direct threat to their hard-won rights. The conflict came to a head over the construction of new Protestant churches. The Bohemian estates claimed the right to build these churches on royal lands, citing the Letter of Majesty. The imperial administration, acting on Ferdinand's orders, disagreed, arguing that the charter did not apply to all royal domains. When the estates' protests were ignored, they concluded that the emperor intended to revoke the charter completely. This grievance, combined with a general suspicion of Habsburg authority, led the Protestant nobles to take matters into their own hands. Their chosen venue for this confrontation was the Hradčany, the historic seat of Bohemian power in Prague. On the 23rd of May 1618, a large assembly of Protestant noblemen convened at Prague Castle to present their list of grievances to the imperial representatives. The meeting, which quickly devolved into a heated and acrimonious debate, was dominated by a sense of deep betrayal and righteous fury. The nobles accused the imperial governors, Jaroslav Božita of Martinique and Vilém Slavata of Chlum, along with their secretary Philip Fabricius, of violating the Letter of Majesty and conspiring against their liberties. The confrontation escalated rapidly when the nobles seized the three officials. In an act of profound symbolic defiance, they threw the men out of a window of the Bohemian chancellery. This event, now known as the Defenestration of Prague, was a deliberate and public rejection of Habsburg rule. Remarkably, the three men survived the 70-foot fall, landing in a pile of refuse, or, as some accounts claim, with divine intervention. The physical outcome, however, was less important than the political one. The defenestration was not a mere act of rebellion, it was a formal declaration of war. The Bohemian nobility immediately established a provisional government, expelled the Jesuits, and raised an army. They then formally deposed Emperor Ferdinand II as their king and, in a monumental act of defiance, elected the Protestant Frederick V of the Palatinate in his place. This move was a direct challenge to the Habsburgs, as Frederick was the son-in-law of James I of England and a prominent leader of the Protestant Union in the empire. The Bohemian Rebellion, once a localized internal dispute, had now engaged the wider confessional politics of the empire. The act of violence in Prague Castle had not only ignited the war, but had transformed a regional conflict into a continent-wide struggle that would devastate Central Europe for 3 decades. The defenestration in Prague rapidly propelled the Bohemian Rebellion into a full-scale war. The Protestant estates of Bohemia, having publicly repudiated Habsburg authority, moved swiftly to consolidate their position. Their most significant act was the formal deposition of Ferdinand II as their king, a direct constitutional challenge to the Holy Roman Emperor's power. In his place, they offered the crown to Frederick VIII, Elector Palatine. This move was highly strategic, as Frederick was a prominent Calvinist prince and a leading member of the Protestant Union, a coalition of German states formed to protect their religious and political interests. By accepting the Bohemian crown, Frederick transformed a regional revolt into a wider confessional war that threatened the very foundations of the empire. Emperor Ferdinand II, supported by the Catholic League under the command of General Tilly, was determined to crush the rebellion and reassert his authority. The Catholic forces moved on Bohemia, aiming to end the revolt decisively. The two armies met at the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620, just outside of Prague. The battle was a short and brutal engagement. The Catholic League's forces, composed of a disciplined and well-equipped army, quickly overwhelmed the unprepared and disorganized Bohemian rebels. The battle was a resounding defeat for the Protestants, effectively ending the Bohemian revolt in a single day. Frederick V, having only reigned for 1 winter, was derisively named the Winter King and forced to flee the kingdom. The aftermath of this victory was catastrophic for the Bohemians. Emperor Ferdinand II initiated a brutal campaign of religious and political reconquest. The Bohemian nobility who had supported the rebellion were systematically punished. Their leaders were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square, and their lands were confiscated and redistributed to loyal Catholic nobles. This land transfer fundamentally changed the social and political structure of Bohemia, creating a new, pro-Habsburg aristocracy. Furthermore, Protestantism was formally outlawed, and the Counter-Reformation was enforced with extreme prejudice. Over the next decade, Bohemia was re-Catholicized, with Protestant clergy and teachers expelled and the population forced to convert or face exile. The Bohemian lands were also integrated more tightly into the hereditary Habsburg domains, losing much of their historical autonomy. While the Bohemian phase was over, the war was far from won for the emperor. The conflict now shifted to the Palatinate, Frederick V's home territory in the west of the empire. The Palatinate was a strategic prize, controlling key trade routes along the Rhine and serving as the center of Calvinist political influence. Catholic League forces, supported by the Spanish, invaded the Palatinate, aiming to seize Frederick's lands and titles. The conflict here was more protracted, with a series of sieges and smaller battles. The invasion forced Frederick V into exile and led to the dismemberment of his lands. His title as Elector was transferred to a loyal Catholic prince, Maximilian of Bavaria. The success of the Habsburgs and their allies in these early phases appeared to secure a decisive victory for the Catholic cause, but this very success would prove to be a grave miscalculation. Their dominance now threatened the balance of power in Europe, compelling other foreign powers to intervene, transforming the war from a German religious conflict into a wider international struggle. The Habsburgs' crushing victories in the Bohemian and Palatinate phases of the war left the Protestant cause in the Holy Roman Empire on the brink of collapse. With the major German Protestant princes defeated or neutralized, a vacuum was created, which foreign powers, driven by a combination of religious allegiance and geopolitical interest, sought to fill. The first to intervene was Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran monarch and, crucially, a prince of the empire through his possession of the Duchy of Holstein. Christian's motives were a blend of faith and ambition. He saw himself as the natural leader of the Protestant cause and aimed to gain territory and influence in northern Germany at the expense of his Habsburg rival. His military campaign, however, was a strategic failure. The Imperial and Catholic League forces, commanded by the brilliant General Albrecht von Wallenstein and General Tilly, proved to be far superior. Christian's army was systematically outmaneuvered and defeated, culminating in a humiliating retreat. The subsequent Treaty of Lübeck in 1629 forced Denmark to withdraw from the war, confirming the emperor's military dominance and the apparent futility of foreign intervention. The Protestant cause was salvaged by a new and far more formidable force, the Kingdom of Sweden under its monarch, Gustavus Adolphus. A deeply religious and charismatic king, Gustavus Adolphus's intervention was motivated by a genuine desire to protect his fellow Protestants from complete subjugation. His strategic motivations, however, were equally important. He aimed to secure Sweden's control of the Baltic Sea, transforming it into a Swedish lake, and to prevent the Habsburgs from extending their influence into northern Europe. Unlike Christian IV, Gustavus Adolphus brought with him a revolutionary new army. The Swedish military was a marvel of organization and discipline, fielding a highly trained force with standardized equipment, including the new flintlock musket. His battlefield tactics were equally innovative, emphasizing combined arms and mobile artillery, which allowed his forces to outmaneuver the more rigid imperial formations. The Swedish campaign, which began with a landing in Pomerania in 1630, rapidly changed the course of the war. Gustavus Adolphus's forces achieved a series of decisive victories, demonstrating the superiority of his military reforms. The most significant of these was the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, a resounding triumph over General Tilly's Catholic League army. This battle shattered the myth of Catholic invincibility and revitalized the Protestant cause throughout the empire. The Swedish army's advance into southern Germany was unstoppable, as they liberated Protestant cities and forced Catholic princes to accept peace treaties. The very nature of the war was transformed. It was no longer a localized German confessional conflict, but a vast international struggle for the control of Central Europe. Gustavus Adolphus's campaign, while brilliant, was also a race against time. He was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, a victory that was nonetheless a devastating personal loss for the Protestant cause. His death created a new power vacuum and prolonged the conflict. However, his intervention had already fundamentally altered the balance of power. He had demonstrated that the Habsburgs were not invincible, and his military tactics would influence European armies for the next century. His legacy was the prevention of a complete Habsburg victory and the ensuring of the Holy Roman Empire's continued fragmentation into a myriad of competing states, effectively ending any realistic hope of a single, unified German state under an absolute emperor. The intervention of Christian IV of Denmark and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had already transformed the war in the Holy Roman Empire, but it was the entry of France that fundamentally changed its character. France was a Catholic nation, and its decision to align with the Protestant cause seemed, on the surface, contradictory. However, the motivation behind French policy was not religious allegiance, but a cold political calculation. The Habsburg dynasty, through its control of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, had become too powerful. France was encircled by Habsburg lands, and its political and economic security depended on preventing a single power from dominating the continent. The war, for France, was not about faith, but about the European balance of power. France had been providing financial subsidies to the Protestant powers since the early stages of the conflict, but its direct military intervention was a major escalation. In 1635, under the direction of its cunning chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, France formally declared war on the Habsburgs. This marked a turning point. The war was no longer an internal German religious conflict with foreign assistance. It was a vast, international geopolitical struggle. The primary theatre of conflict was now not only in Germany, but also in the Spanish Netherlands and along the French-Spanish border. French armies, fighting on multiple fronts, stretched the Habsburgs' resources and prevented them from concentrating their military might on the German states. The French intervention was decisive. Their financial and military support revitalized the Protestant war effort, which had been flagging after the death of Gustavus Adolphus. The French army, a professional and well-equipped force, proved to be a formidable opponent for the Spanish and imperial forces. The war became a protracted and brutal affair, with battles and sieges ravaging the heartland of the empire. The constant fighting, sustained by the military and financial resources of all the major European powers, exhausted the population and decimated the German countryside. The war's duration was prolonged by the involvement of these external powers, as no single side was strong enough to achieve a decisive victory. The nature of the conflict had evolved completely. The religious fervor of the early years had given way to pragmatic political interests. Alliances were now based on strategic necessity, not shared faith. Catholic France fought alongside Protestant Sweden and the German princes against the Catholic emperor. This realignment of European powers demonstrated that the interests of the state and the pursuit of power were more important than confessional ties. The Peace of Westphalia, which would eventually end the conflict, was not a theological settlement, but a political one, a testament to the fact that the war had become a struggle for political dominance, not religious truth. The French intervention, therefore, was the final act that transformed the war from a German tragedy into a European one. The protracted and devastating 30 Years' War was finally brought to a close by the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This was not a single treaty, but a series of interconnected agreements that fundamentally reshaped the political and religious map of Europe. The negotiations, which took place over several years in the cities of Münster and Osnabrück, were unprecedented in their scale and complexity, involving diplomats from nearly every major power on the continent. The central challenge was to address not only the religious divisions within the Holy Roman Empire, but also the broader geopolitical conflicts that had drawn in nations like France, Sweden, and Spain. The settlement that was reached represented a significant shift away from the medieval concept of a unified Christian empire and towards the modern idea of a system of sovereign states. One of the most crucial outcomes was the formal resolution of the religious conflict. The Peace of Westphalia permanently expanded the provisions of the Peace of Augsburg. It not only reaffirmed the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, but also officially recognized Calvinism as a third legal religion within the empire, alongside Catholicism and Lutheranism. This was a monumental concession by the Catholic powers. Furthermore, it established that the religion of a territory would be determined by its status in 1624, effectively freezing the religious map and ending the cycle of forced conversions. This settlement, while not creating true religious tolerance on an individual level, removed religious difference as a valid pretext for war between the member states of the empire. The war, which began over religious freedom, ended with a pragmatic political solution that prioritized stability over religious unity. For the Holy Roman Empire, the political consequences of the peace were profound and, in many ways, fatal. The sovereignty of the member states was formally and internationally recognized for the first time. The treaty gave the princes the right to form alliances and conduct their own foreign policy, a power that had previously belonged exclusively to the emperor. While they could not make war on the emperor himself, this provision effectively transformed the empire into a loose confederation of independent states, rather than a cohesive political entity. The emperor's authority, which had already been weakened by the interregnum and the religious schism, was now codified as largely ceremonial. He no longer had the power to compel his subjects to military or financial support for his foreign policy. The imperial diet, once a consultative body, was now a permanent institution where the princes, electors, and free cities could collectively govern, further eroding imperial control. The Peace of Westphalia also had significant territorial implications. France and Sweden gained new lands within the empire, giving them a formal role in its internal affairs and ensuring a continued check on Habsburg power. France, in particular, gained significant territories in Alsace, solidifying its strategic position on the Rhine. Sweden acquired lands in northern Germany, which gave it a powerful voice in the imperial diet. These territorial changes, combined with the new constitutional framework, ensured that the empire would never again be a single, dominant political force in Europe. The peace established a new framework for international relations based on state sovereignty, national interest, and a balance of power, a model that would define European politics for the next 2 centuries. The 30 Years' War, which concluded with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, left the Holy Roman Empire in a state of profound ruin. The conflict, fought largely on German soil, resulted in widespread devastation. Estimates suggest that the population of the German territories declined by as much as 20 to 40%. Cities, towns, and villages were destroyed by siege warfare and systematic plunder. The agricultural economy was in tatters, with a severe labour shortage and vast tracts of land left uncultivated for decades. Trade routes were disrupted, and the once vibrant urban centres saw a massive decrease in commerce and craft production. This economic and demographic catastrophe was a direct result of a war that had become a brutal, multi-front campaign sustained by foreign powers. The social consequences were equally severe, leading to the collapse of traditional hierarchies and the emergence of a militarized society that had become accustomed to violence and instability. The Peace of Westphalia, in its attempt to resolve the religious and political chaos, codified the empire's fundamental lack of cohesion. The treaty formally and legally recognized the sovereignty of the member states, giving the princes and cities the right to conduct their own foreign policy and form alliances. This provision was a death blow to any remaining imperial centralization. The emperor's authority, already weakened by the investiture controversy and the Reformation, was now a matter of constitutional law. He was reduced to a figurehead, with no power to compel his subjects to military or financial support for his foreign policy. The imperial diet, which now included a permanent Protestant-Catholic split, became an arena for endless debate and political maneuvering rather than a body for effective governance. The empire, in effect, became a loose federation of sovereign states, each pursuing its own interests with little regard for the collective good. This new political order had a profound impact on European politics. The empire, which had for centuries been the dominant political entity in Central Europe, was no longer a single power. Its fragmentation allowed for the rise of new, centralized nation-states like France and Sweden, which had been the primary beneficiaries of the war's outcome. The Habsburgs, while retaining the imperial title, shifted their focus from the Holy Roman Empire to their own hereditary lands in Austria, which they began to develop into a cohesive and powerful state. The German princes, now with internationally recognized sovereignty, became the masters of their own domains. They built lavish palaces, established their own universities, and organized their own professional armies, creating a diverse landscape of competing monarchies and city-states. The Peace of Westphalia's legacy for the empire was therefore one of paradox. While it brought an end to the horrific religious violence, it did so at the cost of the empire's unity and power. It solved the problem of religious war by permanently legitimizing political and religious division. The empire that emerged from the conflict was a ghost of its former self, a hollow political shell that would continue to exist on paper for another century and a half, but lacked any real authority. The great imperial ideal of a universal Christian empire uniting Europe under a single, divinely sanctioned ruler was now a relic of a bygone age. The Holy Roman Empire after Westphalia was a testament to the new reality of European politics, an era of competing nation-states defined by national interest rather than imperial ambition. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which left the Holy Roman Empire in a state of political and economic disarray, created a power vacuum that a new, ambitious state would fill. The Hohenzollern dynasty, a noble house that had previously held a minor position as electors of Brandenburg, now began a relentless process of state-building that would transform them into a major European power. The process was slow and methodical, initiated by Frederick William, the Great Elector, who inherited a fragmented and impoverished state in 1640. He recognized that survival in the new European system of sovereign states required a strong centralized government and a formidable army. His first priority was to rebuild his territory's economy and administration, which had been devastated by the war. Frederick William was a master of pragmatic statecraft. He systematically disempowered the estates, the regional assemblies that had traditionally checked the power of the ruler. He replaced them with a loyal bureaucracy, creating a new, efficient administrative system that was answerable only to him. To fund his ambitions, he imposed new, regular taxes and centralized the collection of revenue, bypassing the local authorities. His most significant achievement was the creation of a standing army, an unprecedented move for a minor German prince. He understood that military strength was the ultimate guarantor of sovereignty. He implemented a rigorous system of conscription and military discipline, establishing a professional army that was far superior to the feudal levies of his rivals. This new army, funded by his centralized treasury, allowed him to defend his territories and project power, earning him respect from both his enemies and his allies. His son, Frederick I, elevated Brandenburg-Prussia to a kingdom in 1701, a monumental step that gave the dynasty a new level of prestige and a place among the great monarchies of Europe. The true architect of Prussia's military prowess, however, was his grandson, Frederick William I, the Soldier King. He was obsessed with the military, spending his entire reign on building a perfect, disciplined, and formidable army. He famously despised the lavish court life of other monarchs, living a Spartan existence and directing all his kingdom's resources toward military spending. He refined the conscription system, established a professional officer corps, and introduced standardized uniforms and rigorous training. His focus was on tactical discipline and speed, transforming the army into a precise, efficient fighting machine. When he died, he left his son not a great kingdom, but an army ready to conquer one. The final and most brilliant figure in this military transformation was Frederick the Great. He inherited his father's magnificent army and used it to launch a series of audacious military campaigns that elevated Prussia to the status of a major power. In the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, Frederick the Great challenged the Habsburgs and their allies, defeating larger and more established armies through superior tactics and the disciplined fighting of his troops. His strategic vision and military genius cemented Prussia's reputation as a military powerhouse. The rise of Prussia represented a profound shift in the German-speaking world. For centuries, the Habsburgs had been the unquestioned hegemons, but with the emergence of a powerful militarized state in the north, the balance of power within the Holy Roman Empire was permanently altered, setting the stage for a new and fierce competition for German dominance. The rise of Prussia as a major power in northern Germany created a fundamental shift in the political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire, replacing the traditional struggle between the emperor and his princes with a new and more destructive dynamic, the Austro-Prussian rivalry. For centuries, the Habsburg emperors of Austria had been the undisputed hegemons of the German-speaking world. This was challenged not by an external enemy, but by an internal competitor whose military and administrative efficiency were unprecedented. The rivalry was not a matter of a minor princely squabble, but a direct confrontation between two great powers for control of German affairs. The initial catalyst for this rivalry was the War of the Austrian Succession, which began in 1740. When Emperor Charles VI died without a male heir, he left the Habsburg lands to his daughter Maria Theresa. This succession was challenged by several European powers who sought to seize parts of her vast inheritance. Frederick the Great of Prussia saw an immediate opportunity to expand his kingdom and, in a calculated act of aggression, invaded the wealthy Habsburg province of Silesia without a formal declaration of war. This province, rich in resources and population, was a geopolitical prize that would significantly enhance Prussia's power at the expense of its larger rival. The subsequent conflict, while involving many European nations, was defined by the relentless struggle between Austria and Prussia for control of this single territory. Maria Theresa, a brilliant and determined ruler, refused to accept the loss and spent the remainder of her long reign dedicated to its recovery. The conflict over Silesia was not resolved by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. Both powers knew that another war was inevitable. Maria Theresa, in a stunning diplomatic reversal known as the Diplomatic Revolution, abandoned her traditional alliance with Britain and aligned herself with her centuries-old enemy, France. Her goal was to form a powerful coalition to isolate and defeat Prussia. The resulting 7 Years' War, a global conflict, was fought on German soil primarily as a renewed struggle for Silesia. The war was brutal and destructive, with Prussia and its smaller allies facing the combined might of Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden. Despite being on the brink of total defeat, Frederick the Great's military genius and the timely collapse of the anti-Prussian coalition saved his kingdom. The Treaty of Hubertusburg in 1763 confirmed Prussia's permanent control over Silesia. The outcome of these wars had profound consequences for the Holy Roman Empire. The Habsburgs had not only lost a vital province, but their image, as the preeminent German power, had been irrevocably damaged. The empire, a body designed to resolve conflicts between its members, was utterly powerless to stop the wars between its two most powerful states. Its institutions, like the imperial diet and the imperial circles, became mere forums for debate, as Austria and Prussia bypassed them entirely. The other German princes were forced to choose sides, further deepening the political and confessional divisions of the realm. The old imperial ideal of a unified, universal authority had been replaced by a new reality, a system of competing states where power was based on military strength and national interest. The Austro-Prussian rivalry had fractured the empire beyond any hope of a future political restoration. The 18th century in Europe was defined by a profound intellectual and political transformation. The Age of Enlightenment gave rise to new philosophical concepts that fundamentally challenged the medieval institutions upon which the Holy Roman Empire was built. The era's emphasis on reason, individual liberty, and the pursuit of knowledge directly contradicted the empire's feudal, decentralized, and divinely sanctioned structure. The concept of the nation-state, where a single government held absolute sovereignty over a defined territory and its people, gained ascendance. This new model of governance was the antithesis of the empire, which was a patchwork of hundreds of autonomous entities, each with its own ruler, laws, and customs. The very idea of a universal Christian monarchy, once the ideological cornerstone of the empire, was now considered an anachronism. The political reality of the empire in this period was a testament to its obsolescence. While the Habsburgs held the imperial title, their authority over the member states was nominal at best. The Peace of Westphalia had granted the princes full sovereignty, and they exercised this right with increasing confidence. The electorates, duchies, and free imperial cities all began to behave as independent powers, entering into diplomatic relations and military alliances with foreign nations without any reference to the emperor. This made the empire's institutions, like the imperial diet, largely irrelevant. The diet, a permanent assembly designed to resolve disputes and legislate on behalf of the realm, became a forum for endless, inconclusive debate. Decisions were slow to be made, if they were made at all, and the body lacked any real power of enforcement. It was an organization of states, not a single state. The rise of nationalism was another powerful force that undermined the empire. In the modernizing states of Europe, people began to identify not with a universal Christian empire, but with their own language, culture, and territory. In the German lands, this was not a unified German identity, but a collection of distinct regional allegiances. People saw themselves as Prussians, Bavarians, Saxons, or Austrians first, and as subjects of the Holy Roman Empire second. This fragmented sense of identity made it impossible for the empire to inspire the collective loyalty and unified action necessary to survive in a world of cohesive, competing nation-states. It could not mobilize a unified army or raise a common defense, as the princes would only commit their forces when their own specific interests were at stake. The empire, therefore, became a relic, a historical curiosity, that existed on paper but held little sway in the great political conflicts of the day. The wars of the 18th century, particularly the wars between Austria and Prussia, were not fought under the imperial banner, but as conflicts between two sovereign powers. The smaller states, in turn, were forced to align themselves with one side or the other, further formalizing the empire's division. The imperial title was more a symbol of prestige for the Habsburgs and a tool for their own dynastic interests than a source of genuine authority. The Holy Roman Empire struggled to adapt to a world that had moved beyond its medieval framework, and its institutions, unable to evolve, were left behind by the intellectual and political currents of the era. The late 18th century, a period of profound upheaval in Europe, delivered the final fatal blow to the Holy Roman Empire. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, shattered the old political and social order, replacing it with new, radical ideas of popular sovereignty and nationalism. The empire, a relic of medieval Christendom, was fundamentally incompatible with these revolutionary concepts. Its decentralized structure and its many semi-independent rulers were unable to respond effectively to the external military pressure and ideological challenges emanating from France. The emperor, a Habsburg, saw the French Revolution as a direct threat to monarchical authority and a danger to his own dynastic lands. The German princes, however, were often divided, with some welcoming the revolution's anti-feudal ideas, while others remained paralyzed by the threat of its military power. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte turned the ideological threat into a concrete one. His military campaigns and his genius for political reorganization were the instruments of the empire's destruction. The French armies, no longer fighting with the professional mercenaries of the old regime, were a force of citizen soldiers, driven by revolutionary fervor and a new sense of national identity. They swept into the German territories of the empire, defeating the armies of the Habsburgs and the Prussians with a speed and efficiency that exposed the empire's military weakness. The empire was, for all intents and purposes, incapable of raising a unified, effective defense. Its component parts, each with its own foreign policy, were more concerned with preserving their own territories than with the survival of the imperial whole. Many smaller states were eager to ally with Napoleon to protect themselves from their larger German rivals, further accelerating the empire's fragmentation. Napoleon's reorganization of the German political map was both systematic and brutal. In 1803, the Reichsdeputation's Hauptschluss, or the final imperial recess, completely redrew the map of the empire. In a single stroke, nearly 300 of the smaller states, including many ecclesiastical territories and free imperial cities, were absorbed by their larger neighbours. This massive consolidation was a calculated move by Napoleon to create larger, more stable German allies for France. The medieval patchwork of tiny states, which had defined the empire for centuries, was wiped out in favour of larger, more manageable kingdoms like Bavaria and Württemberg. This administrative overhaul was a direct assault on the empire's constitutional foundations. The very idea of a universal, divinely sanctioned empire was rendered moot when its member states were created and dissolved by the will of a single powerful emperor. The final act of the empire's demise came in 1806, following Napoleon's decisive victory over Austria at the Battle of Austerlitz and his creation of the Confederation of the Rhine. The empire had become entirely impotent. Napoleon demanded that the remaining German princes leave the Holy Roman Empire and join his new confederation, effectively severing their last remaining ties to the old imperial structure. On the 6th of August 1806, Emperor Francis II, facing the reality of his political powerlessness and fearing that Napoleon would claim the imperial title for himself, formally abdicated and dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. The act was a sombre and pragmatic acknowledgement that the empire, a 1,000-year-old institution, had ceased to exist not with a grand collapse, but with a simple legal declaration. Its final death blow was not an invading army, but a single signature on a document. Napoleon's decisive military victories over the great powers of Europe provided him with the authority to act as the supreme arbiter of German affairs. The empire, incapable of a unified defense, became a canvas for his geopolitical ambitions. This period of dramatic transformation, primarily orchestrated through the final imperial recess, or Reichsdeputationshauptschluss, of 1803, was less a gradual evolution and more a systematic dismantling of a millennium-old political order. Its primary mechanisms were the processes of secularization and mediatization, which together eliminated the empire's archaic patchwork of small states. The first of these processes, secularization, dissolved the numerous ecclesiastical principalities that had been a unique and enduring feature of the Holy Roman Empire. For centuries, prince-bishops and abbots had held temporal power over their territories, functioning as sovereign rulers. Napoleon, in a pragmatic move to reward his German allies, abolished these states entirely. The vast lands and wealth of these territories were confiscated and distributed to the larger secular German princes, such as those of Bavaria and Prussia. This act, sanctioned by the Imperial Diet itself, was a profound legal and political revolution. It removed an entire class of imperial states from the map and solidified the power of the secular rulers. The second process, mediatization, was an equally radical reorganization. This was the absorption of hundreds of small autonomous political units, including free imperial cities, counties, and minor principalities, by their larger, more powerful neighbors. These small states, once directly subject to the emperor, lost their sovereignty in a stroke of the pen. Their rulers and local governments were subordinated to the newly expanded kingdoms and duchies. This rationalization of the political map, a concept from the French Revolution, was anathema to the empire's historical and legal tradition. It replaced a complex, decentralized network with larger, more consolidated polities, which were easier for Napoleon to control and utilize. The culmination of this reorganization was the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806. This new political entity formally replaced the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a league of 16 German states, with Napoleon as its self-proclaimed protector. The members of the Confederation, including the newly empowered kingdoms of Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, were required to renounce their allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire and provide military contingents to Napoleon's armies. This new body was not a continuation of the old empire, but a completely new creation designed to serve French interests and act as a reliable buffer against Austria and Prussia. The ancient legal and administrative structures of the empire were systematically dismantled, from its highest court to its local jurisdictions. The very notion of a universal imperial law, a foundation of the empire for centuries, was replaced by the sovereignty of the individual states. The emperor was now a monarch without an empire, and a millennium of German history was erased from the political map in favor of a modern, more centralized state. The final act of the empire's long decline was a single, definitive legal decree. In 1806, following Napoleon's creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, it became clear to Emperor Franz II that the imperial title had been rendered meaningless. Napoleon's demand that the princes renounce their allegiance to the empire was a direct challenge to the emperor's authority. Facing the reality of his powerlessness, and fearing that Napoleon would seize the imperial title for himself, Franz II made the pragmatic decision to abdicate. This was not the result of a military defeat, but a symbolic, legal act that brought 1,000 years of history to a close. On the 6th of August 1806, the emperor formally resigned his title and dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. This act was both anticlimactic and profoundly significant. The empire, which had existed for a millennium as a loose collection of states, officially ceased to exist. The ancient and complex relationship between the emperor, the German princes, and the papacy was severed. The resignation of Franz II marked the end of the concept of a universal Christian monarchy in Central Europe. The title of Roman Emperor, which had been held by Charlemagne and Otto the Great, was abandoned. Franz II, anticipating the change, had already taken the title of Emperor of Austria in 1804, recognizing that his dynastic power in his hereditary lands was far more real than his nominal authority over the empire. The dissolution left a clear political vacuum in the German lands, a vacuum that would eventually be filled by the forces of nationalism and the rise of the modern German nation-state. The Holy Roman Empire, as Voltaire famously said, was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire, but its dissolution was a monumental event that officially concluded the medieval political order and cleared the way for the modern world. Following the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the Holy Roman Empire entered a long period of slow decline that historians often refer to as its political twilight. The treaties, in recognizing the full sovereignty of the empire's member states, had fundamentally transformed its constitutional nature. The emperor was no longer a monarch with genuine authority over the realm, but rather a symbolic figure whose power was now largely confined to his own hereditary lands. The empire, which had for centuries been a complicated, layered political body, was now in practice a loose confederation of independent states with their own foreign policies, legal systems, and military forces. The institutional framework of the empire, such as the imperial diet, remained in place, but was increasingly rendered impotent by the realities of a new international order based on the balance of power between sovereign nations. This profound constitutional shift was accompanied by a critical change in imperial strategy. The Habsburg emperors, while still holding the prestigious imperial title, began to focus their administrative and military efforts on consolidating their own dynastic territories in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. The vast resources of the Habsburg monarchy were no longer primarily used to defend the empire as a whole, but to build a centralized, bureaucratic, and modern state within their own domains. The imperial crown remained a tool of prestige and diplomatic leverage, but it was no longer the core of their power. This detachment meant that the empire's collective interests were often secondary to the personal and strategic needs of the Habsburg family. The emperor was not just a ruler, but first and foremost a great European prince, and his actions were driven by the interests of Vienna, not the needs of the empire's other members. The waning of imperial authority was most evident in the behavior of the powerful princes. With their newfound sovereignty confirmed by international treaty, states like Bavaria, Saxony, and Brandenburg-Prussia acted as independent powers. They formed their own alliances, entered into treaties with foreign monarchs, and maintained standing armies without imperial permission. The emperor's ability to compel military service or to collect taxes from these states diminished to a point of near non-existence. The empire's internal structure, a patchwork of autonomous regions with a powerless head, struggled to present a united front against any external enemy. The empire was frequently a battlefield for the wars of its members, rather than a political entity capable of waging its own campaigns. External pressures, particularly from Bourbon France and the Ottoman Empire, continued to test the empire's fragility. The Habsburgs were often forced to bear the full burden of defending the imperial borders on their own. The Turkish advance on the eastern frontier and the French expansion into the Rhineland exposed the futility of the old imperial system. The emperor, as a Habsburg archduke, would raise an army from his own lands and lead the defense, only to find that the other princes were unwilling to commit their own resources unless their immediate interests were threatened. The political life of the empire was no longer a single unifying story, but a complex series of independent narratives, each centered on the ambitions and interests of its many sovereign states. The long twilight was the age of these princely states, and it was their rise that defined the final 2 centuries of the Holy Roman Empire. The early 18th century was dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession. This global conflict, a Europe-wide struggle to prevent a single power from dominating the continent, demonstrated the empire's growing military and political impotence as its territories became a battleground for other nations' ambitions. The vast Spanish inheritance, which included Spain, its American colonies, and territories in Italy and the Netherlands, became the prize of a dynastic struggle. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, died childless in 1700, bequeathing his entire empire to Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the French king Louis XIV. This threatened to unite the crowns of France and Spain under the Bourbon dynasty, creating a hegemonic superpower that would dominate all of Europe. The prospect of a Franco-Spanish superpower was unacceptable to the other great powers, including the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, who was a member of the Austrian Habsburg family. Leopold I saw the Spanish throne as a legitimate inheritance for his own family, and was unwilling to allow the Bourbons to seize such a vast empire. The emperor's claim was based on the old Habsburg dynastic ties to the Spanish throne. The subsequent conflict was therefore both a dynastic struggle for the Spanish crown and a broader conflict to maintain a balance of power in Europe. The war, which lasted from 1701 to 1714, became a global conflict, fought not only in Europe but also in North America and at sea. The Holy Roman Empire's territories became a primary battlefield for this struggle. The war was fought on imperial soil in Italy and the Rhineland, with French, Bavarian, and other forces arrayed against the Habsburgs and their allies. The empire, as a political entity, was incapable of raising and sustaining a unified military effort. Its member states, now sovereign powers in their own right, acted independently based on their own interests. The princes of Bavaria and Cologne, for example, sided with France against the emperor. The other states, while nominally supporting the emperor, contributed troops and resources only when it was convenient or when their territories were directly threatened. The Imperial Diet, the empire's highest legislative body, was a forum for endless debate and a symbol of the political paralysis that prevented a coordinated response to the French threat. The war's outcome, formalized by the Treaty of Utrecht, was a classic example of a negotiated peace that preserved the balance of power. The Spanish throne went to Philip of Anjou, but on the condition that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united. The Austrian Habsburgs received the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, and parts of the Spanish inheritance in Italy. While the Habsburgs expanded their own dynastic lands, the empire as a whole was further weakened. The war demonstrated that the empire's territories were little more than a chessboard for the ambitions of other European powers. Its institutions were shown to be largely irrelevant, and its members were confirmed in their role as sovereign states pursuing their own interests. The War of the Spanish Succession was a testament to the fact that the old imperial ideal was now a historical curiosity, and the new reality was a Europe of powerful competing nation-states. The 18th century, a period often called the Age of Enlightenment, produced a profound shift in intellectual and political thought that rendered the medieval institutions of the Holy Roman Empire increasingly anachronistic. Concepts of reason, individual rights, and state sovereignty replaced the older ideals of universal monarchy and divine right. The empire, a political entity that drew its legitimacy from its historical ties to a universal Roman imperium and its religious link to a united Christendom, was fundamentally incompatible with this new secularized world. Its decentralized, fragmented structure was now not only a political weakness, but a conceptual one, a living contradiction to the new, streamlined political ideals taking hold in nations like France and Great Britain. This intellectual climate provided a fertile ground for criticism, and one of the most famous and devastating critiques came from the French philosopher Voltaire. In his 1756 work, Essay on the Manners and Spirit of Nations, he penned a line that would become a succinct, cynical, and enduring epitaph for the Holy Roman Empire. He wrote that the empire was neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. This statement, while a powerful rhetorical device, was a pointed summary of its perceived institutional failures. The term holy was a nod to its spiritual link to the papacy, a connection that had been broken by the Reformation and the bitter religious wars. The adjective Roman was a reference to its tenuous and often disputed claims to be the legitimate heir to the classical Roman Empire. Its political centre was not Rome, but a collection of German cities and Habsburg territories. Finally, empire was a critique of its impotence. It was a loose collection of hundreds of states with no central military or administrative authority, incapable of acting as a unified sovereign power on the European stage. While not entirely accurate, the empire did maintain some legal and institutional functions, and the term Roman held significant cultural weight. Voltaire's observation captured the general sentiment of the time. It was a reflection of how the empire was viewed by the new, centralized nation-states that were rising to prominence. These new states, with their efficient bureaucracies, strong standing armies, and unified national identities, saw the Holy Roman Empire as a relic of a bygone era. The intellectual and political currents of the Enlightenment, therefore, did not merely describe the empire's decline. They provided a new vocabulary to express its irrelevance. Voltaire's famous line, in its brilliant simplicity, distilled the essence of the empire's final centuries and remains a powerful historical observation to this day.